Photography is very cool. People like it. But it wasn't always just whipping out your phone and snapping a selfie. How did photography go from a futuristic fantasy to smearing chemicals on glass plates to the modern cell phones and the convenience of photography that we have today? In today's quite long video, we're going to go over the entire history of photography, I guess. And the first stop on the long and winding road that led to the invention of photography is something called the camera obscura. The oldest mention of this device and its effects was by a gent called Mosey. And despite his name sounding like an EDM producer, he was a Chinese philosopher. Mosey was the first to notice that an image from a camera obscura is flipped upside down and from left to right, due to the light moving in a straight line. So you may have heard of this other dude called Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher that contributed innumerable ideas to the world of science and philosophy. And while he was primarily known as a philosopher, he contributed a lot of other ideas to the fields of science and math and other things. And he was also one of the earliest to observe the camera obscura effect. Aristotle would go on to use the camera obscura to help study optics. In 500 BC, the philosopher discovered that by passing sunlight through a pinhole, he could create a reversed image of the sun on the ground. He used this device as a means for viewing an eclipse without having to stare directly at it. And I'm guessing that's because somebody well before him had already burned their eyeballs to a crisp looking at the sun. This strange reversal effect was also noticed in Euclid 4th century BC and Theon of Alexandria in the 4th century AD. And despite these interesting observations, Aristotle's experiments went no further. He could not explain why the image was created or why it was in reverse. And I'm guessing he was like me. Whenever I can't figure something out, I assume it's magic and move on. In 1035, there was an Egyptian called Ibn al-Haytham. Try saying that 5 times fast. Actually, I did, trying to learn how to say it. But for this next little bit, we're just going to call him Ibn. Ibn was not content to just assume that the camera obscura's strange effects were magic. Ibn continued Aristotle's work by devoting himself to the understanding of what makes up light. He had a theory that light traveled in straight lines, called rays, and he set out to prove this theory by arranging a line of candles on a table and standing behind a screen that separated him from the candle's light. I also tried doing this, but the devil appeared. Ibn poked a hole in the screen and watched as the light rays passed through the hole. The image from the candle placed on the left side of the hole would pass through it and strike the wall on the right. Light from the top of the candle flame would move downward through the hole. Thus, Ibn had proved that light traveled in straight lines. He recorded his findings in a book called Kitab al-Manazir, which roughly translates to optics, probably. Centuries later, that book found its way to Europe. In Italy, an obscure inventor called Leonardo da Vinci caught wind of Ibn's work. He decided to do his own experimentation with mirrors, lenses, and pinholes. In 1510, he figured out how to draw this S. I'm kidding, but he did say this: when images of illuminated objects pass through a small, round hole in a very dark room, and you'll see on the paper all those objects in their natural shapes and colors. They'll be reduced in size and upside down, owing to the intersection of the rays at the aperture. In 1521, Da Vinci had a student called Cesare Sarrasino. Honestly, not a very creative name. What should we name him? I don't know. Let's just use the last name again. Anyway, Cesare published the first description of the camera obscura, but it wasn't widely read at the time. Public did not gain knowledge of this new device until an account was written more than 30 years later by Italian nobleman Giovanni Battista della Porta. He described the process for assembling the camera obscura in his book Magia Naturalis, or Natural Magic. And he had this to say: you must shut all the chamber windows, and it will do well to shut up all the holes besides, lest any light breaking in should spoil all. Only make one hole, as great as your little finger. When the sun shone through the hole, an image would appear, and what is right will be left, and all things changed. And well, when you put it like that, it does sound sort of magical. Della Porta was first able to manipulate the image through the use of the camera obscura. Fitted with convex lenses and mirrors, a concave mirror would enable the device to reflect an image right side up. He was first able to come up with real practical uses for the device as well. He suggested that artists could use the camera obscura to project images from nature onto a piece of paper, and this would assist the artists in rendering their works. And it would be this method where the camera effect would first be utilized to help capture an image. Although, as this video link would tell you, we're a long way from photography at this point. Thrilled by this new invention, Della Porta brought his friends over to his house. He's like, hey everybody, come check this out. Look what I figured out. He was really excited, got his entire setup together, and he made the projection start happening. He was projecting real humans on the walls. And instead of his friends being awestruck by the invention, they were all mortified, appalled by the invention. They thought, this is obviously the work of the devil. And isn't it funny how anytime something interesting or cool comes around that it's always the work of the devil? Like Pokemon, for example. I still remember being a kid and the pastor getting all bent out of shape about Pokemon cards. Or parents burning the Harry Potter books. But I digress. Perennial party poopers, the Catholic Church caught wind of Della Porta's invention and promptly awarded him a prize. Nope, that's not what they did. They charged him with sorcery, and Delaporte's work was banned for 6 years. I'm an attorney. I wish I had a client charged with sorcery. Stay focused. We gotta stay focused. In 1604, German astronomer called Johann Kepler studied the mathematical laws governing mirrors' reflection, and 7 years later he worked out the theory of lenses. Those scientists were unknowingly providing invaluable services for the artistic industries. And eventually it would be these same advancements that we would need years later so we could have really sick lenses for our Sony A7R6s. Good thing they were thinking ahead. Throughout the next century though, there'll be a number of advancements to the camera obscura, gradually over time improving the design. A German mathematics professor called Daniel Schwinter discovered that by drilling a hole in a wooden ball and by placing a lens on either end, he could focus the image in any direction he wanted. And a scientist called Friedrich Riesner would invent a portable version of the camera obscura. His portable camera obscura was housed inside a collapsible tent, and the shrinkification continued in the years following. A German monk called Johann Zahn invented a camera obscura that was just 9 inches by 24 inches, which really doesn't sound like a very small camera today, but at the time, that was basically the iPod of camera obscuras. Inside the box, there was a mirror that he placed at a 45-degree angle to the lens. The mirror reflected the image to the top of the box, where he placed a sheet of frosted glass. That glass was then covered with tracing paper, which an artist would use to help render their images. And believe it or not, Zahn's design would be in use for almost 200 years by artists. Further assisting artists was the invention of a new tool called the camera lucida by William Hyde Wollaston. This was invented in 1806. This was no actual camera, but rather a piece of glass prism suspended at eye level from a brass rod. This device enabled even the most untrained artist to trace an image on a piece of paper by allowing him to view his subject and the paper at the same time. But even then, the camera lucida still required the trained hand of an artist to be able to render a good-looking, decent image. And there were still tons of other people out there that wanted to capture their reality. So that brings us through a lot of the advancements and developments with the projection of an image. The next step for making photography a thing was, how do we capture the image? How do we make the image permanent? Those would be the next problems for the scientists to help solve. We would still need quite a few more discoveries before we would be able to send grainy Snapchat nudes. So let's go through the history and all the developments of helping try to capture an image. Silver nitrate was discovered by Albert Magnus, and silver chloride was discovered by George Fabricius. And despite their discovery early on, neither of these dudes were able to notice the photochemical effect that took place when either of these chemicals were exposed to light. Seems like a funny thing to have missed. Although it was more an inconvenience than anything, in 1614, Angelo Sala noted that sunlight will turn powdered silver nitrate black, and that paper wrapped around silver nitrate for a year will also turn black. The discovery of this particular chemical reaction would be critical for the advancement of photography, as many processes that we use even to today still rely on this reaction. Wilhelm Homburg described how light darkened some chemicals in 1694, and he called it the photochemical effect. Around 1717, German polymath Johann Heinrich Schultz accidentally discovered that a slurry of chalk and nitric acid, into which some silver particles had been dissolved, was darkened by sunlight. After some experiments where he had lines of thread kind of tied around the bottle and put the bottle in direct sunlight, to his surprise, those lines were still visible in the solution. He then tried applying stencils of words to the bottle, and he was able to replicate the words. And those impressions persisted until he shook the bottle back up. It's kind of like an early Etch-a-Sketch. Schultz called the substance scodophers, and he first published his findings in 1719. He thought the discovery could be applied to detect whether metals or minerals contained in any silver, and hoped that further experimentation by others would lead to some useful results. Schultz's processes resembled later photogram technique, and these were sometimes regarded as the first forms of photography. Imagine if photography had never advanced past that point. We're just walking around showing each other our chalky water bottles. That'd be pretty weird. So Tefeng Delaroche, who was probably Jacques Delaroche's cousin, not sure about that, he was an early science fiction author. He was famous for writing the novel Gepanti. In the novel, Delaroche described something quite similar to color photography, process for fixing fleeting images formed by rays of light. And he said this: they coat a piece of canvas with this material and place it in front of the object to capture. The first effect of the cloth is similar to a mirror, but by means of its viscous nature, the prepared canvas, as is not the case with the mirror, retains a facsimile of the image. The mirror represents images faithfully, but retains none. Our canvas reflects them no less faithfully, but retain them all. This impression of the image is instantaneous. The canvas is then removed and deposited in a dark place. An hour later, the impression is dry, and you have a picture, more precious in that no art can imitate its truthfulness. Delaroche thus imagined a process that made use of a special substance in combination with the qualities of a mirror, rather than using the camera obscura. The dark place in which the pictures dried suggested that he was thinking about the photochemical effects that must be required by the substance. People often credit this as what would become the first conception of what we would think of today as photography. English inventor and photographer Thomas Wedgwood is believed to have been the first person to have thought of creating permanent pictures by capturing camera images on material coated with a light-sensitive material. He originally wanted to capture images with a camera obscura, so he was kind of marrying the two technologies, but he found that those images produced by the camera obscura were too faint to have any effect on silver nitrate. Wedgwood did manage to copy painted glass plates and captured shadows on white leather, as well as paper moistened with silver nitrate solution. Attempts to preserve the results with their distinct tints of brown or black, sensibly differing in intensity, had failed. His images were able to be preserved temporarily in darkness, but would all, over time, eventually fade. Imagine going out and taking an awesome photo, but you could only look at it a few times before it would fade away. Kinda problematic. French balloonist, professor, and inventor Jacques Charles is believed to have captured fleeting negative photograms of silhouettes on light-sensitive paper at the start of the 19th century. So at this point, we are well on our way to taking pictures. We have the camera obscura, we have photochemical effects and photographic chemicals. We just need something else. What do we need? It's the fixer. This brings us to the point in the video where we're going to talk about what many consider to be the founder of photography proper, and that's Nicephore Niepce. For his first experiments, the Frenchman positioned at the back of the camera obscura sheets of silver salts coated paper known to blacken in daylight, just like we talked about utilizing that photochemical effect. In May of 1816, he produced the first image of nature, a view from a window. It was a negative and the image vanished because in broad daylight the coated paper becomes completely black. At the time, he called these images retinas, but the same old problem persisted for Niepce. Just like Metallica, the images faded to black. Like many who came before him, he was looking for a process that would allow him to fix the images permanently. His first attempt was through a process called photo engraving. Niepce used a resin consisting of minerals, asphalt or bitumen of Judea. Yes, I know what you're thinking. Yes, asphalt, or as it's also known, bitumen of Judea, is a photoreactive substance, believe it or not. Niepce demonstrated that under light action, the resin becomes non-soluble with the usual solvent. From 1822 on, he succeeded in reproducing drawings put in contact with bitumen-coated bases, glass plates, calcareous stones, and copper or tin plates. Afterwards, he used aquafortis process to etch the images made with acid, which were then printed onto paper. This process was to remain in use for quite a while, the base of photo engraving used to print photos and geographical documents. In 1824, he used lithographic stones coated with bitumen at the back of the camera obscura and obtained for the first time ever a fixed image of a landscape. Because of the substances involved, at the time it was a really long exposure. I don't mean like a couple minutes, I mean like a couple days. Starting in 1825, he regularly used copper plates, but then he moved on to tin plates, and all the while continually making etched images. The invention of photography by Niepce was documented in letters to his brother. In 1926, his prototype camera was used to take the first ever photograph. This was captured out the window of his home in Le Gras, France. Niepce's first permanent image, the world's first photograph, View from the Window at Le Gras, was created by Nicephore Niepce in 1826. Niepce created the photo with the camera obscura focused onto a sheet of 20 by 25 centimeter oil-treated bitumen. Niepce gave the photo to his friend and botanist Francis Bauer. It was last publicly exhibited in 1898, and after that, it was forgotten. Helmut Gersch brought the photo again to prominence in 1952, and the Eastman Kodak Company also made a copy. In 1973, the University of Texas acquired the plate, and today the plate is on display at the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center, and according to many, it's one of the most important photographs ever taken. So let's go over in detail the process that Niepce used to create that first image. Niepce dissolved light-sensitive bitumen of Judea in lavender oil and applied a thin coating over a polished pewter plate. The photosensitive agent, like we talked about earlier, is bitumen of Judea, and it's a photoreactive substance and has been around since ancient times as a form of tar. People in antiquity used to collect it from the Dead Sea surface, where it kept surfacing continually from the bottom of the sea. It was used by the Egyptians to embalm mummies, to caulk ships, or even to make terrace works in Babylon. By the 19th century, people already knew how to extract this tar from bituminous rocks. He inserted the plate that he had covered in bitumen into his camera obscura and pointed it out his window. We don't really know the exposure time, but given the chemicals and compounds involved, people think it was anywhere from 8 hours to a couple days. After the exposure, there was no visible image. Niepce would dip the plate in a diluted lavender oil bath. That sounds luxurious. And it was that lavender oil bath that would dissolve away the bitumen parts that hadn't been exposed to light, leaving the permanent image. The resulting image would be a negative. And with that invention, there were seemingly endless possibilities for commercial applications of this new tech. Things were off to the races. In 1829, Niepce partnered with Parisian painter Louis-Jacques Mendes Daguerre, hoping to reduce the long exposure time the previous invention had required. And why that name should sound familiar was because of the invention that came next, and that was the daguerreotype. And this was the first form of photography with acceptable, reasonable-ish exposure times. In 1839, in exchange for lifetime pensions, the French government bought their photography technique, and it became the first publicly available photo-taking system. This availability of the technology played a pivotal role in the widespread use of photography going forward. First photographic camera designed for commercial manufacture came about in 1839, and this camera was invented by a gentleman named Alphonse Giraud. He had signed a contract with Daguerre and Niepce to produce cameras in France. His camera was a daguerreotype camera that had a double box design, a landscape lens fitted to the outer box, and a holder for the glass focusing screen and image plate in the inner box. The daguerreotype required only minutes of exposure time in the camera and produced clear, finely detailed results. At the time, Giraud's camera cost about 400 francs. As Daguerre continued to streamline the system and make things better and perform better, it was the Austrians that invented better camera lenses that pushed things even further. One of the most famous lens makers making lenses for those early cameras was someone by the name of Voigtlander, whose famous name we still find on many exceptional lenses today. He was able to reduce the size and thus the portability of the box design in 1841. The sliding concept of a two-part box gave way to the leather accordion-type bellows with a lens plate at one end and the light-sensitive plate holder at the other end. These plate cameras have remained relatively unchanged since that time. Although now called view or large format cameras, the design changes persist today in the world of large format photography. And at the time, the 8x10 format became the most popular format for large format photography. And I guess at the time, it wasn't large format, it was just normal format. The metal-based daguerreotype process soon had competition from the paper-backed options. And these were the calotype negatives invented by William Henry Fox Talbot. And these were invented and demonstrated in 1839, soon after hearing about the daguerreotype. Subsequent innovations continued to make photography more innovative and versatile, a trend that would continue and is still continuing to today. Exposure times had already fallen from days to minutes. They would go from minutes to seconds, and then from seconds to fractions of a second. Photographic chemicals and technology continued to get cheaper while also becoming more practical. And over time, more and more processes started to pop up. There were ambrotypes, wet colloiding process on glass, tin, or ferrotype, dry plates, and finally, just before the turn of the century, sheet and roll film. And just a word about wet colloiding plates, these were invented by Frederick Scott Archer, an English sculptor and photographer. In 1851, he described his wet colloiding process by which finely detailed glass negatives were produced. From these, paper positives could be printed. The plates had to be developed before the sensitized colloiding dried after exposure, so that a darkroom tent and portable laboratory were needed for outdoor photography. The new process produced such good results that it dominated photography for a generation. A lawsuit by Talbot claiming that the wet colloiding process was merely a variant of his own process was dismissed. Archer also invented the ambrotype, which we mentioned a second ago. This was a cheap form of portraiture, and because Talbot had invested all of his money in research, he died in poverty. Photographers had largely shifted to the wet plate colloiding process due to the improvements in image quality over all the previous processes. English photographer and physician Richard Leach Maddox was a participant in what was called photomicrography, photographing minute organisms under a microscope. Something that we still do today. And it was during this process that he started to notice negative health effects that he associated with being around the wet plate colloiding process. It was due to the wet colloiding's ether vapor that was affecting his lungs and his breathing, and so Maddox began looking for a substitute. He suggested in the 8th of September, 1871, British Journal of Photography, an experiment with gelatinous bromide that sensitizing chemicals, cadmium bromide and silver nitrate should be coated on a glass plate in gelatin, a transparent substance that at the time was used for making candies. Eventually, Charles Harper Bennett made the first gelatin dry plates, and before long, the emulsion could be coated on a celluloid base. Dry plates had been tried before, but those who had messed around with dry plates hadn't quite got them to work. One formulation was one of silver nitrate with a binder of albumin derived from egg white. This was widely used for printing paper in the 19th century and had been coated on glass, but these proved to be too insensitive for camera use. Gelatin had also been suggested by photo theorist and color pioneer Thomas Sutton, and the substance would have been known to Maddox. At the time, just like we said, he was an eminent microscope user, and he would have known about that through its use in holding and preserving microscopic slides. And additionally, Maddox had tried other bases. He combined silver bromide with vegetable gummy matters, lichen, linseed, and other things. And he also tried starchy substances like rice, tapioca, sago. And while these sound like the recipes for some of the worst fruit snacks that I've ever heard of, he was certainly on the right track. Maddox had this to say about all the weird concoctions that he had tried. Often I fancied I was just within the doorway when the door closed, and other plans had to be tried. Finally, he tried gelatin, and this was from a packet of Nelson's gelatin granules. Maddox prepared a number of plates, exposing by contact printing them from other negatives and putting each through different exposure trials. He talked about the differences in the photos. The resulting prints were very delicate and detailed, color varying between a bistre and an olive tint, and after washing dried to a brilliant surface. He later described trials on out-of-door subjects, as he called them, but it was impossible to get some laurels depicted in anything more than black and white. Maddox freely gave his discovery of the dry gelatin process to the world. He had this to say in 1887. "I had no thought of bringing the subject into notice until it had been lifted from the cradle. Early formulations of this process were very slow and unforgiving. It was these developments, pun intended, I'll be here all day, that led to the miniaturization and adaptation of photographic emulsions, and consequently it paved the way for social, action photography, and cinematography. The advantages of the dry plates were obvious. Photographers could use commercial dry plates off the shelves instead of having to prepare their own emulsions in a mobile darkroom. Negatives didn't have to be developed immediately, which meant that there was no need for a development room to be nearby, which finally freed photographers to take their cameras, lenses, and all their gear with them to other places and capture a variety of scenes." Can you imagine what those first few decades of photography were like, where you had to prepare your own plates and then have a development place nearby? I mean, that was so cumbersome. And at this time also, we started to see the first cameras that were small enough to be able to be handheld. Further research created fast exposure times, which led to snapshot photography and the Kodak camera and roll film. Before the invention of dry plates, photographers bought chemicals and made their own photosensitive chemicals, but now they can buy ready-made plates, spawning an entire industry and putting photography into reach of millions. We're going to have a whole lot to say in this video about Georgia Eastman, but first let's talk about some of the original photography concerns other than Kodak. If you're like me, before I started making this video, I thought Kodak was the original manufacturer of dry plate films. While Kodak is going to get a lot of the credit for their popularization and manufacture of many of their commercial film products, there's one company that I don't feel gets the respect it deserves, and that's Keystone Dry Plate and Film Company. The Keystone Dry Plate and Film Works was founded by John Carbutt in 1879 in Philadelphia, and its 113 Berkeley Street location was constructed in Germantown in 1884. The factory became the location of his pioneering work in new photographic technologies, including the improved glass plate photography, X-ray imaging, and 35mm celluloid film. The first to manufacture 35mm celluloid film, I should point out, and also very early color photography technologies. It's honestly amazing how many early photography advancements were achieved by John Carbutt. Carbutt developed the first gelatin bromide dry plates in 1879, the first orthochromatic dry plates in 1886, and the first celluloid dry plates in 1888. At this location. Perhaps most importantly, he developed the world's first 35mm film. And interestingly, one of his very first customers of that 35mm film was Thomas Edison. Keystone was not only the first to successfully market draw plates, it also led the industry in reliability and quality. John Corbett was the first to innovate orthographic plates that rendered color tonality relations in black and white, as our eyes actually see them. As a result, portraits were much more naturalistic. And as we already said, in 1888, Corbett was the first to manufacture and sell film. Notably, this was ahead of Eastman Kodak. And the way that he achieved this was through a carefully sliced block of cellulose. This too immediately revolutionized photography. Within months, there were rolls of film in new formats. In 1890, 35mm was also invented here as the new standard format for the kinetoscope or movie film. We talked about how Corbett and dry plate works invented X-ray photography. It would ultimately be that invention, though, that was thought to be his undoing, as X-rays were radiating in all directions, and at the time, we didn't really understand the dangers of those X-rays, and Mr. Corbett was oftentimes unprotected. Corbett's health mysteriously declined as he battled tumors. He passed away in 1905, probably from the cancers relating to his X-ray exposure. And moving on to another company, and this one is one fortunately we still have with us. Lots of times these companies like to create really polished and wholesome corporate images that they carefully maintain over their existence. But that's not really the case for Ilford. Ilford Photo was founded when Mr. Harmon suddenly left his wife for another woman and started making photographic plates in his home. Old man Ilford set out to make some changes. The history of Ilford Limited goes back to 1879 when Alfred Harmon started his business in the basement of his own home. The business was then called Britannia Works. His staff consisted of 2 men and 3 boys with assistance at busy times from his wife and his housekeeper. Fortunately for us, Ilford still makes film today. Another early photography concern that's worth mentioning is AGFA. In 1867, chemists Paul Mendelssohn Bartholdy and Carl Alexander von Martius founded their company near Berlin. The company produced aniline colors. This was the creation of artificial colors that could replace their oftentimes more expensive natural counterparts. And one could see how a business that focused on the chemistry relating to the development of colors might naturally lend itself to the production of photographic chemicals. In 1867, chemist Mame Anderson drove the company to do just that. Its first success was in 1888 with the developer of Rodinol, another product that is still with us today. It wasn't though until 1898 that AGFA would begin shipping its first X-ray and photographic film products. Over the years, AGFA will become one of the most important companies in the film industry, not only bringing to market a number of films and chemicals, but also making major contributions to the world of photo finishing equipment. You could find their equipment in labs all over the world. Another company of significance was Anthony and Scoville. The E.H.&T Anthony Company, later known as Anthony and Scoville. It was a prominent American photographic supplier. These guys were like B&H Photo, Freestyle Photo, or Adorama before we had the internet. They began by selling daguerreotype cases, camera boxes, and photographic chemicals. They were also involved in the production of dry plates, cameras, and other photographic equipment in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Anthony and Scoville were the corporate predecessors to Ansco. Another company that we would be remiss to not mention at this point is one Carl Zeiss. The early history of Carl Zeiss in the field of photography is closely tied to the company's optical expertise and innovations. Carl Zeiss, a German optical instrument maker, founded the company Carl Zeiss in Jena in 1846. The company initially focused on producing microscopes, telescopes, and other precision optical instruments. And you can imagine being a company that existed producing optical devices at the time photography came around. I mean, they're just sitting there licking their lips. So yeah, when photography came around, Zeiss was going to get in on that action. Naturally, in the late 19th century, as photography gained popularity, Zeiss recognized the potential of applying its optical expertise to camera lenses. The company's first significant foray into photography occurred with the introduction of its anastigmat lenses in 1889. The lens was designed by the physicist and mathematician Dr. Paul Rudolph. The anastigmat lens was groundbreaking due to its optical quality. It addressed the issue of optical aberrations in photography, providing sharper images. This marked the beginning of Zeiss's reputation as a high-end precision optical manufacturer, and that's a reputation that they still enjoy today. The success of the anastigmat lens laid the foundation for Zeiss's expansion into the photographic market. In 1890, Zeiss launched the Protar lens, another innovation that further improved the image quality in photography. Zeiss continued to develop and release new lens designs, establishing itself as a leading provider of high-quality optics for cameras even to today. It wouldn't be a history of photography video without mentioning the company Lotz, or as it's known today, Leica. Ernst Lotz Optischwerk, commonly known as Lotz, had been a significant player in the field of optics and imaging equipment, much like Carl Zeiss. The company was founded by Ernst Lotz, a German businessman and optical engineer. The company was established in 1869 in Wetzlar, Germany. Wetzlar was historically known for its optical industry, and Lotz chose the town for its location and enterprise. Much like Carl Zeiss, the early years of the company were primarily devoted to the production of microscopes. Lotz gained the reputation for manufacturing high-quality optical instruments, and the business steadily grew, and they moved into the world of photography as the hobby grew in popularity. And at this point, obviously, there are oodles of companies, just hundreds of companies, that existed that contributed to the development and advancement of photography, but these were some of the major players, and it gives you just an idea of the timelines and some of the innovations that these companies had brought forth. But that list, obviously, by no means is exhaustive. And while we spent a lot of time talking about these other companies, there is one notable company, perhaps the most notable company, that we haven't mentioned much yet, and that is the company from Rochester, George Eastman's Kodak. George Eastman was born on July the 12th, 1854, in Waterville, New York. His father, George Sr., had started a small business school, as one does, called Eastman Commercial College in Rochester. George Sr. moved his family to Rochester in 1860. Sadly, George Sr. died suddenly when Eastman was 8, and this would be one of the most important and impactful things on young George Eastman's life. And to make matters worse, one of Eastman's older sisters was wheelchair-bound from polio and died when Eastman was 16. So safe to say, not the best of time in the Eastman household. But ultimately, it was this difficult background that would forge George Eastman into the person he was. But it almost goes without saying that the loss of his father and his sister contributed to financial strains on the Eastman household, and these were the conditions that George Eastman was brought up in. Eastman's mother, Mary, took in boarders to support the family, and Eastman dropped out of high school at age 14 to add to his family's income. He began working as a messenger and office boy for insurance companies and studied accounting at home to qualify for a higher salary. Can you imagine studying accounting at age 14? I was still smashing G.I. Joes together and blowing spit bubbles. His hard work would eventually pay off though, and he eventually landed a job as a bookkeeper at the Rochester Savings Bank. Back in 1878, Eastman was planning a trip to the Caribbean, and he planned on using the wet plate colloiding process to take photos on his Caribbean trip. Recall that this technique entailed taking a very clean glass plate and coating it with a thin solution of egg white. This was to make the subsequent emulsion stick. Then we coated the plate with a solution of gun cotton and alcohol mixed with bromide salts. It was a messy, time-consuming process. I honestly can't imagine going through all that trouble for a normal day of shooting. And we talked about the developments of photography and the advancement of photography from the wet plate colloiding process to the dry plate process. And looking for a better alternative, Eastman quickly shifted over to dry plate photography. While Eastman originally embarked on this project for his own hobby, he quickly began to see the commercial possibilities of manufacturing plates for other photographers. His early emulsions gave acceptable results, but applying them consistently to glass plates was difficult. The common practice was to spread a hot emulsion across a glass plate with a rod. This method produced variable results and was time-consuming and inefficient. In 1884, he invented a machine for coating the photographic emulsion onto a flexible material. He designed and sold a roll film adapter for plate cameras, but faced a difficult market because the long rolls required special equipment and were harder to process than glass plates. Additionally, the film was hard to hold flat, which resulted sometimes in unsharp images. It was this that prompted George Eastman to create the first Kodak camera. Because of the difficulties we just talked about, Eastman realized that he needed a whole new system based around rolls of film. In 1888, he introduced the first camera designed for use with roll film, and he called it the Kodak. The name of the camera was chosen based on the sound of the camera made when the exposure occurred. His slogan was, "You push the button and we do the rest." The choice of the company name was a big part of Kodak's history. In 1888, Eastman dubbed his new company Eastman Kodak. Though it sounds like an early merger occurred, Kodak is nothing more than a hard-sounding word that Eastman liked enough to trademark. At the time, the founder stated, "The letter K had been a favorite with me. It seemed strong, incisive sort of letter." Eastman and his mother used an anagram set to find the right-sounding K word. His only criteria was that the name should be short, easy to pronounce, and not bear any resemblance to the names that already existed. And I think they did a darn good job, because there's only one thing we all think of when we hear the word Kodak. The original Kodak was fitted with a rotating barrel shutter unique to this model. The shutter was set by pulling up a string to the top of the camera and operated by pushing a button on the side of the camera. After taking a photograph, the key on the top of the camera was used to wind the film onto the next frame. No viewfinder on the camera. Instead, two V-shaped lines on the top of the camera leather are intended to aid aiming the camera at the subject. The barrel shutter proved to be expensive to manufacture and unreliable in operation. The following year, the shutter was replaced by a simpler sector shutter in the #1 Kodak. The customer bought the Kodak film camera with enough film in it to capture 100 images. Then they mailed the entire camera and lens system back to Kodak, and Kodak would develop the film. The camera would then be reloaded with film and mailed back to the customer. The developing and printing cost at Kodak at the time was $10 for those 100 images. Kodak advertisements from 1888 also state that any amateur could finish his own pictures. Spare rolls of film were sold at the time for $25. $25 in 2022 money, though, would be about $750. And the $10 for the return trip, sending your camera to Kodak, them developing the images, making prints, and then sending it all back to you, reloaded and ready to go again, was about $300. The Kodak camera was a complete game changer. The world had never before seen anything like the Kodak's ability to quickly capture images. The original Kodak camera was a prime example of the razor and blade business model, where Kodak sold the cameras for cheap to get it into as many hands as possible, and planned to make their money back in the sales of consumables such as roll films and services. For every camera Kodak sold, there would be a loyal customer out there dependent on Kodak's services and products, just like razors and blades. I don't even know if razors and blades is a good example anymore. I think a better example is probably a Nintendo Switch. It was this razors and blades model that would allow Kodak to sell their cameras so cheaply to the public. It allowed the general public to consider owning a camera and taking photos. It turned photography into a hobby for many. This in turn snowballed into more sales and more revenue for Kodak. It was a win-win for everybody involved. Customers loved their cameras, and Kodak loved making money. And it was the profit from these original Kodak cameras that allowed Kodak to funnel that money into innovation and continue the advancement of photography, lenses, and all of their product ranges. Kodak would continue its unprecedented run of success through the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. In 1891, Kodak sold its first daylight loading camera, so a photographer no longer needs to load film in a darkroom. In 1896, Kodak manufactured its 100,000th Kodak camera. Another important camera that I think we should spend some time talking about is Kodak's Brownie camera. This was lots of folks' first blush with a Kodak camera, and this was the camera that really propelled Kodak's success into the stratosphere. Designed by Frank A. Brownell, the unique name of the Brownie camera was inspired by the mischievous spirits called brownies, which perpetuated in European folklore. The little spirits presented just the right casual and youthful vibe for what Kodak hoped would be a popular and accessible camera, and boy were they right. The original Brownie sold for $1, which was about $31 in 2022 dollars. The camera used 117mm film, which was also pretty darn affordable, and was processed by sending your shots back to Kodak, or at this point, local labs that had begun springing up. The original Brownie was produced in 1888 and was released in February of 1900. It's an example of a box camera. The basic premise is simple. A lens, which is a hole, usually uncovered in the early years, on the front of the camera. Many box cameras offered a tab that could be pulled for a smaller aperture for brighter light scenarios, and behind the lens was a simple shutter mechanism. Typically, only one shutter speed was available, plus a bulb mode option to leave the shutter open for as long as the user desired. Each exposure was made by pressing a lever on the side of the camera. At the internal end of the camera box, the camera obscura effect exposed the loaded film. The winding knobs on the side of the box allowed the frames to be advanced between shots, and the little red window on the back let the user count their frames. Modern photographers will be accustomed to the viewfinder of a DSLR, but in the days of box cameras, little mirrored viewfinders on the top of the camera were the best way to align your image. For the first time, the hobby of photography was in the financial reach of virtually everyone. Kodak produced many versions of the Brownie camera, including the Model 2, which would famously use 120 format film. However, due to the incredible success of their new consumer cameras, Kodak began to use that particular film for other types of affordable equipment. Kodak eventually released a line of folding cameras that used 120 film. The cameras had bellows stretching the distance between the lens and the emulsion on the back of the film, thereby producing a large image. However, unlike the box Brownie, could be easily folded and slipped inside a pocket or a briefcase. The folding pocket Brownies and the autographic Brownies were produced for years and proved to be very, very popular for Kodak. Box Brownies continued to be produced into the 1950s. And just a few words about George Eastman's later years. Eastman cared about his employees. He was the first American businessman to grant workers shares in the profits made by the company, and for a company that was so wildly successful as Kodak at the time, this was huge. He also gave away large amounts of his huge fortune to the University of Rochester. George Eastman remained a bachelor for all of his life. After a long battle with an illness, George Eastman committed suicide on March the 14th, 1932. He wrote notes to his friends that said, "My work is done. Why wait?" Throughout the early 20th century, Kodak produced a range of cameras, many of them proving to be wildly successful, and they innovated and pushed photography forward in a number of ways. They became the dominant supplier of both film cameras and film. However, there'd be a few cameras and innovation particularly that would really take photography to the next level, and one notable advancement was the creation of color film. While the very first films that were created were black and white films, that didn't mean that there wasn't any development going on with color film. In fact, innovation with respect to color film technology was advancing as well. The history of color film really begins with hand coloring. Since the very first images were produced and the wonder of photography began to spread around the world, there were already folks wondering why the images they captured were not in color. Why were they only in black and white or grayscale? But all the while, scientists, photographers, and businessmen and experimenters labored. The practicing photographers became impatient. Photographers, eager to give their customers a little taste of color, soon took the matter literally into their own hands and began to add colors to their monochrome images. As the writer of a guide to painting photographic portraits noted in 1851, when the photographer has succeeded in obtaining a good likeness, it passes into the artist's hands, with whom skill and color give it a lifelike and natural appearance. Several different processes and materials were used for hand coloring, and at the time at least, the early hand coloring techniques and processes were much cheaper to the early color film processes. At the time, it provided studio employment for miniature painters who had initially felt threatened by the emergence of photography. I mean, that makes sense. Photography coming around as this new medium to capture images exactly as they appear, no longer requiring an artist's impression. I can see why they would be nervous about their jobs being threatened. In skilled hands, effects of great subtlety and beauty could be achieved by this hand painting technique. However, even at its very best, hand coloring remained an unsatisfactory means of rendering color. It could not reproduce the colors of nature exactly. We were at the point now where photographs could accurately capture light and shade, but we needed something that would also allow for the capture of color data. Concerning the early color photography experiment, color photography has been a goal since the early days of photography in the mid-19th century. Early experiments by photographers such as James Clerk Maxwell and Thomas Sutton in the 1860s involved taking separate black and white photographs through red, green, and blue filters and then combining them to produce color images, a concept that laid the foundation for future developments in the industry. This won't be the last time we're talking about color layers. While the fundamental theory was understood, the idea that you would have separate color layers, red, green, blue, and they would capture particular wavelengths of light, an idea of exactly how to do that remained elusive. Not long after Maxwell's 1961 demonstration, a French physicist, Louis Ducos-Duhauron, announced a method for creating color photographs by combining colored pigments instead of light. 3 black and white negatives taken through red, green, and blue filters were used to make 3 separately dyed images which combined to give a colored photograph. This method forms the basis of today's color photographs. Be it in the form of RGB color layers, or be it in the form of RGB pixels, it's still basically what we use. In 1891, Gabriel Lippmann, a professor of physics at Sorbonne, demonstrated that color process which was based on the phenomenon of light interference, the interaction of light waves that produces the brilliant colors you see in soap bubbles. This process won Lippmann the Nobel Prize in 1908 and was marketed commercially for a short time around the turn of the 19th century. While all of this work was very scientifically important, it was, at the time at least, not very useful. Exposure times for these processes were long. You were, in effect, taking 3 different images, so you're stacking that exposure time, and the photographic materials required to capture the individual colors were scarce. And that leads us up to something called the chromogram. What a sick name, right? The chromogram. The American photographer and inventor Frederick Ives devised a system based on 3 color separation negatives taken through colored filters. This was a system devised by James Clerk Maxwell. From the negatives, positive transparencies were made, which were placed in a special viewer called the chromoscope. Mirrors in the chromoscope superimposed the images on 3 transparencies, and a second set of filters restored the colors. Chromograms, which is what the resulting images were called, They were effective, but they were prohibitively expensive at the time. Ultimately, Ive's system was much too complex to achieve much mainstream use. After chromograms, though, we had the Jolly process. In this process, instead of having 3 separate exposures, a red exposure, a green exposure, and a blue exposure, this process would instead involve putting a filter on the front of the camera, which would combine all 3 primary color layers. The first process to use this method, as we already talked about, the Jolly method, was devised by John Jolly of Dublin, Ireland in 1894. Jolly covered a glass plate with very fine red, green, and blue lines, less than 0.1 millimeter wide, in order to create a 3-colored filter screen. When taking a photograph, this screen was placed on the front of the camera with a plate. After exposure and reversal processing, black and white positive image was carefully replaced in the register with another filter screen. The result was a color transparency which could be viewed by transmitted light that passes through an object. The Jolly process was introduced commercially in 1895 and remained on the market for a few years after that. However, the limited color sensitivity of the plates ultimately limited the outputs. The results were very faint and not really commercially viable. The next process, and the first process that folks would probably deem to be acceptable color photography, is the autochrome process. The first properly usable and commercially successful screen process, the autochrome, was invented in the early 20th century by 2 French brothers. Those darn French always coming up with cool stuff. The 2 brothers were Auguste and Louise Lumière. They had been experimenting with color photography since the 1890s and published their first article on the subject in 1895, the same year that they were to achieve lasting fame for their invention of the cinematograph. And this was the very first early motion picture machine. In 1904, they gave the presentation of their process to the French Academy of Science, and by 1907, they had begun to produce autochrome plates commercially. News of their discovery began to spread around the world, and folks wanted to get their hands on the autochrome process and try it out for themselves. For the very first time in world history, folks could go out with their photography equipment and capture true-to-life, accurate color images. Eventually, though, they would realize that there was no need to keep the filter screen separate from the emulsion and would eventually combine the filter screen and the emulsion into one tidy package. And now we're getting somewhere. So how do the autochrome plates work? Well, they were actually pretty darn simple to use. They required no special apparatus, and photographers were able to use their existing cameras. Exposure times, though, were relatively long, about 30 times that of conventional plate, and that was due to that additional light filtration layer. Even in very bright sunshine, ISO 100 light, an exposure would need to be at least a second or longer. And in cloudy situations, the exposure times could balloon to 10 seconds or more. Even in a very well-lit studio, an exposure time could be at least 30 seconds. Imagine having to sit perfectly still for 30 seconds while your portrait was being taken. Following exposure, autochrome plates were reverse processed to produce a positive image. When viewed by transmitted light passing through the plate, the millions of tiny red, green, and blue violet grains combined to give a full-color photograph, accurately reproducing the colors of the original subject. In theory, the grains were mixed and distributed randomly on the surface of the photo. In practice, however, mathematical probability meant that the grouping of grains of some of the same colors was inevitable. While individual grains are invisible to the naked eye, these groups of clump are visible, and they're the reason why autochrome's distinctive beauty in comparisons to the work of pointillism are made. And I've shown some images here, and I think they look really, really cool. By 1913, the Lumiere factory in Lyon, France was producing about 6,000 autochrome plates per day. Pretty darn good. Commercial success of the Lumiere brothers' autochrome process prompted the creation of many more color photography processes, spurred innovation in the industry. Innovation from the autochrome process was one called the Dufay color process. And this one was also invented by a Frenchman called Louis Dufay. Dufay color first appeared in 1932 as a 16mm cinema film, followed in 1935 by roll film. It employed a geometric screen made up of red lines, alternating in rows of green and blue rectangles. Although, compared to the contemporary black and white emulsions, it was only 1/3 the speed. Whereas the autochromes appealed to more serious photographers, the Dufay color process appealed to the more casual point-and-shoot photographer. A processing service which returned finished transparencies mounted and ready for viewing opened up color photography to a whole new class of photographers. The Dufay color process was the last of the color screen process, and it remained on the market until the 1950s. All of the processes that we've talked about thus far in the video have been additive color processes, where the addition of colors red, green, and blue are added to the image to give it the full color appearance. But now it's time to move on to subtractive color processes. The subtractive color processes would provide the innovation needed to bring color photography mainstream. What is subtractive color photography? The original theory for subtractive color reproduction can be traced back to the French physicist and inventor Louis Ducos de Hauran. We've already talked about him already in this video, who explained the method in his book Le Color en Photographie, Solution des Problèmes, 1869. I know you guys are loving my Kentucky French. De Hauran proposed that the color separation negative should be used to produce 3 positive images, which would then be dyed to complementary colors of cyan, blue-green, magenta, blue-red, and yellow. Each of these complementary colors absorbs or subtracts one of the primary colors. Cyan absorbs red light, reflecting a mixture of blue and green light. A cyan image therefore performs the same function as the red filter layer used in the additive process. Similarly, magenta absorbs green light and yellow absorbs blue light. By accurately superimposing these 3 complementary colors, all other colors can be reproduced. The color of the subtractive process comes from the dyes and the pigments rather than the color filters. With subtractive color, white, for example, is represented by clear glass or white paper rather than light passing through 3 layers. This means that subtractive processes are much less wasteful of light. More importantly, they work with reflected light rather than transmitted light, means that they can be used to reproduce color photographs on paper. How did subtractive color processes work? The development of subtractive color processes followed 2 distinct paths. Firstly, the design of specialized cameras for taking sets of color separation negatives, and secondly, in search of practical methods making and superimposing 3 positive images in complementary colors. When taking color separation negatives of stationary subjects, like a vase of flowers, a conventional camera could be used. The color filter simply needed to be changed after each exposure. Subtractive color processes such as Vivex require color separation negatives to be made on 3 separate photographic plates. However, if all 3 could be combined into a single unit or tri-pack, there would be no need for specialized color cameras of repeating back fitted with filters. It was the invention of tri-packs which paved the way for the invention of modern color films like Kodak. The first practical tri-pack system was introduced by Frederick Ives, an American inventor, in 1916. You know, the dude from the 1800s and the chromogram. After Ives' inventions, other tri-pack systems followed, including one very famous failure, the color snap process. But we don't have time to talk about that because we've got to talk about something very important, and that is the invention of Kodachrome.
Imagine a picture so sharp and so vivid that the finest detail is etched clearly and unforgettably. That's why Kodak makes Kodachrome film, the sharpest color slide film you can buy. As you can see, the sharper you want your memories, the more you need Kodachrome film. For Kodak, America's storytelling.
From the creation of Kodak's very first films in the 1800s until today, Kodak has been the industry leader in film production. It wasn't until the 1930s and the creation of Kodachrome that Kodak would really take color photography to the next level. Almost all of our grandparents had a box of those colorful cardboard slides laying around the house somewhere that we've encountered at some point. Kodachrome was one of the first successful color reversal films. The film was developed by 2 Kodak researchers, both of which, in a very strange coincidence, had the name Leopold. It was Leopold Godowsky and Leopold Mans. The 2 researchers began working on Kodachrome in the early 1930s, and it was formally released by Kodak in 1935. And these 2 boys did such a good job that in 1939 they were awarded the Perkin Medal by the American Chemical Society. It's like a Grammy, but for nerds. I said it earlier in the video, but Kodachrome is a reversal film. What does that mean, you ask? Reversal film is just a positive film. Instead of making a negative on the film substrate, it actually forms a positive image. We call this slide film. And slide film is really cool. It could be projected, put the slide over a light source, project the image on the wall to view. Think of it as home movies before there were movies. Or you can make a print directly off the negative as well. So really cool technology. And there were a couple things that Kodachrome became famous for. One was the very saturated, very realistic colors that people enjoyed from the film, provided color like no other film available at the time, but also the complex development process. And this was due to the complexity of the film. The way this would work was there would be 3 layers to the emulsion. There'd be a red layer, green layer, and a blue layer, just like you'd expect. The thing that made this different from what we think of as normal film development, and the thing that made Kodachrome so complex and difficult to work with, is that each layer had to be dyed individually during the development process. So each layer, the red layer, the green layer, and the blue layer, and then you'd go back to the lab and dye each layer red, green, and blue, the 3 layers then coming together to form a full color image. Holy crap, that's a trip. A couple of other things that Kodachrome became known for, first and foremost, the high image quality, but also the high archival stability. The film was known to be really stable if the slides were well taken care of, and those slides would last for a really long time, preserving those special memories for years and years to come. And all of these qualities that we've talked about, the high image quality, the wonderful colors, and the archival ability, would lead to Kodachrome becoming a really popular choice among amateurs and professionals. Over time, Kodak would release Kodachrome in many formats ranging from 35mm to medium format. There was one major drawback to Kodachrome, and it was how expensive it was. And there was a very particular reason for that. Unlike any film that we buy now presently, we buy the film, we send it off to be developed. It's 2 independent costs, right? So it's $15 for a roll of film, $10 at the lab to get it developed. But Kodachrome was unique in that it could only be developed by Kodak for a time. So Kodak would have to price in the development cost into the film sale. Despite Kodachrome's popularity amongst film photographers, unfortunately film photography itself would see a massive decline in the early 2000s due to the onset of digital photography. And this would lead to Kodak ultimately discontinuing Kodachrome in 2010. So let's take a look at some images and talk about these Kodachrome colors. Kodachrome was known for having vibrant, warm, saturated colors. They were rich. Kodachrome was also known for having a wide tonal range, from capturing very bright colors to very muted, desaturated colors, and the film having the ability to carefully distinguish between the two. Kodachrome was also known for having a very high resolution. At ISO 64, it was a very fine-grained film, capable of producing very fine detail. And as we know, the resolution of a film stock is determined by its grain size, and with the film being an ISO 64, at ISO 64, Kodachrome had relatively small grain compared to a lot of the other films available on the market at the time, making it capable of capturing very high resolution images with very fine detail. Talking a little bit more about the development process of Kodachrome, there were a number of steps involved in this process. First step was obviously exposure. Kodachrome was stuck in the back of a 35mm camera or a medium format camera, and you took a picture, exposing the film to light, storing the image in the photochemicals. And a note about the exposure times of Kodachrome: with it being a 64-speed film, you're going to get longer exposure times with this film. And this was due to having the 3 different layers that had to be independently exposed on the film base. So as simple as the first step was, taking a picture, this is where things get kinda weird. Kodachrome used the K14 development process, which everybody knows contains lots of steps. The first step in the process was to soak the film in an alkaline bath. This would soften the cellulose and allow the anti-halation rimjet layer to be removed. It's after the removal of the backing that we get to the application of the first developer. And this is a pretty standard developer. It converts the silver halide crystals into metallic silver via a PQ bath. After the film goes through the wash, the film is exposed through the backing with a red light. And the point of exposing the film to this red light is it makes the undeveloped silver halide layers developable through the cyan layer. The next step is the cyan develop, and this contains a cyan developer, blue, and a cyan coupler. After the blues are developed, the film is washed again. Who wants to keep track of how many times we're washing this film? The next step is blue light exposure from the top. And the point of this, much like the red light exposure, is to make the undeveloped silver halide crystals, this time in the blue layer, developable. What a word. The next step is the yellow developer, which is similar to the cyan developer. Consists of a yellow developer and also a yellow coupler. The next step in the process is adding the magenta developer. And this one actually contains a fogging agent which makes all remaining undeveloped silver halide crystals in the image developable. Friggin' English. And after that, we wash the film. Again, the next step is a conditioner. And this is really simple. It just prepares the metallic silver in the film for the bleach step, which leads us to the bleach step. And this step is to convert the metallic silver in the film into silver halide. And now we're finally at what looks more like a normal film development lab. We're at the fixing step. The point of the fix step, as ever, is to convert the silver halides into soluble compounds. And we wash the film again, this time to wash away those soluble compounds. After that, we rinse the film and we dry it. Whew! I can see why Kodak and other labs don't want to fool with K14 anymore, because that was a mouthful. And if you can believe it, that was the more simplified, modern K14 development process. The original process from the 1930s actually contained more steps and was even more complex. So, goodness gracious, what a process. I think it goes without saying, but the process was complex and time-consuming. Kodachrome, really cool, an important part of photographic history, and I love looking at those old images. There is one more important film to talk about, though, with respect to color photography, and that's Agfacolor Nu. In 1936, Agfa, a company we've already talked about in this video, the German company, also announced a multicolor layer film. Agfa had been making additive color process plates since 1916, so they called their color film Agfacolor Nu. Nu to indicate that it was a completely different product from any of their earlier products. Agfacolor Nu was the first commercial process to follow Rudolf Fischer's theory of using color couplers. Agfa's research chemists discovered a way of anchoring couplers to the individual emulsion layers. This made Agfacolor film much easier to process. Unlike Kodachrome, it could even be done by the user at home. The details of Agfa's research became freely available, and other companies such as Ferrania Color, Geneva Color introduced color film photography on the same principle. With the perfection of dye-based multicolor layer films such as Kodachrome and Agfacolor Nu, a new era of color photography had arrived. The race to achieve color film photography was over. So we've talked quite a bit about all the things that went into the invention of photography. Well, that's not anywhere near the end of the story. Now we're going to talk about how 35mm became the most common film format. Thus far, we've talked about Aristotle, camera obscuras, the invention of photographic film, George Eastman, and the advancement of color film photography. But now that we've got film, we're going to need cameras to shoot it in. And at least thus far in the history of photography, there have been just tons and tons and tons of formats. And nothing is really kind of consolidated. Nothing has rose to the top to become kind of the dominant format. Even today, one of the most common sensor sizes that we see with digital cameras is 35mm. But where exactly did those dimensions come from? In 1889, Kodak introduced the first commercial transparency roll of film, which would make possible Thomas Edison's movie picture camera in 1891. The 35mm format was first developed on an experimental scale in Thomas Edison's laboratory more than 120 years ago. Edison's associate William Dixon created devices for photographing and viewing moving images on film loops 35mm wide. This width originated by slitting 2.75-inch wide rolls in half and adding perforations, those famous holes in the film that we all know and love even still today. It took years, though, for 35mm film to become a regular product in Kodak's portfolio. There would really need to be one more innovation before things could really take off. The first publicly available 35mm cameras, though, were the Tourist Multiple and the Simplex. The Tourist Multiple was built in the US by the company Herbert and Hugeson, which was released in 1913. It was actually a half-frame camera. The Simplex was invented by Alfred Huger Moses and was released in 1914. It existed in a number of different models, many of which allowed convertible full-frame and half-frame exposures. The Simplex Model B was the only one to use the standard 35mm format. It was only produced from 1914 to 1918. This takes our story back to Germany, to the company that was founded in 1869 in Wetzlar. We talked about their early production of microscopes and binoculars, but later they would move on to producing camera lenses. But the name Leica is closely related to the name of Oskar Barnack, the inventor of the first 35mm camera. Oskar Barnack was an asthmatic and had a lung ailment, which made it difficult for him to go out and take photos. Since 1905, Barnack had the idea of reducing the format of negatives and enlarging the photographs after they had been exposed. At the time, cameras were heavy, difficult to transport, and the luxury of printing a photo with larger dimensions is the merit of Oskar Barnack, whose motto was small negative, large picture. In 1912, Barnack began work on a new motion picture camera, but he struggled to get the shutter settings right. This was largely because the emulsions were quite inconsistent at that time. Proper exposure in the early days of motion pictures were challenging because of the lack of devices such as photoelectric meters. In response to this, Barnack created a film tester to determine the correct exposure settings. Barnack's device would allow for small test exposures to be processed and exposure issues adjusted accordingly. This prototype device became known as the Leica, where the German prefix means prime or original. It was equipped with a micro Sumar, 4.5 6-element 42mm lens. From the beginning, the Leicas used the same 35mm width film that movies did, and used the sprocket holes along with the sides to control the position of the film as it was advanced through the camera. Barnack's design allowed the camera to move the film horizontally, increasing the frame size to increase to 24 by 36mm instead of the 18 by 24mm exposures of the cameras that carried the film vertically. This essentially created a double-sized image. The aspect ratio changed from 3:4 to 2:3. With the onset of World War I, it was not until 1924 that Leica decided to produce the 35mm camera, with the 35mm Leica 1, making its first appearance at the Leipzig Spring Fair in 1925. The Leica 1 had an all-metal housing, a collapsible lens, and a focal plane shutter. The Leica succeeded because it was compact, and the quality of the exposures was as good as the more commonly used roll film. This format became the 35mm standard for photographic and modern full-frame camera sensors from that point on. These small cameras allowed photographers to direct their attention to form rather than detail, and a whole new type of picture structure grew out of their use. Due primarily to its use in the cinematography, 35mm film was everywhere, and by the nature of that motion picture film being so widely available, that drove prices down. The number of exposures which could be loaded into a camera was 40 at the time. Initially, the film had to be hand-loaded in the dark. However, Barnack soon realized this was a problem, and developed a reloadable cassette which could easily be inserted into a camera and could accommodate 36 exposures. By 1932, Leica's competitor Zeiss had introduced the 35mm camera Contax, and Kodak entered the market in 1934 with the Retina 1. The standardization efforts for 35mm film were crucial in establishing its dominance as a film format. In 1934, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO as it was known, introduced the 35mm film standard known as the 135 or 135 format. ISO is an international standard-setting body that aims to promote global industrial and commercial standards. 35mm film standard specified the dimensions of the film strip as 24mm width, 36mm in height. The standardization of these dimensions was crucial because it allowed for compatibility between different cameras, lenses, and film processing equipment. Additionally, the standard defined the placement and dimensions of the sprocket holes on the film. By establishing these specifications, the ISO 35mm film standard enabled photographers to use various camera models, lenses, and film stocks interchanged without compatibility issues. This standardization greatly contributed to the widespread adoption of 35mm film as a versatile and accessible format for photography. It's worth noting that even though the ISO 35mm film standard was widely accepted, there were some variations in alternative formats within the 35mm category. For example, some cameras used perforations that were slightly different in size and placement. However, these variations were pretty minor and didn't impact the compatibility of those 35mm cameras. Standardization played a significant role in the success of 35mm film by ensuring that photographers could readily use different equipment and rely on consistent processing methods. The ease of use and compatibility ensured that the format's popularity and eventual dominance in the world of photography. The ease of use and compatibility contributed to the popularity and eventual dominance of 35mm film in the world of photography. That's not to say that the standardization efforts were the only reason that 35mm became so popular. There were a number of other reasons as well. Here were a few of those. World War II and photojournalism, for example. The compactness and portability of 35mm cameras made them particularly suitable for photojournalism. The bodies were small and unobtrusive and made them easy to conceal and not be so obvious when someone was out on the street trying to take a picture. During World War II, photographers like Robert Capa and others used 35mm cameras to capture the realities of war and convey powerful visual narratives. The widespread coverage and impact of their images helped solidify the status of 35mm film as the preferred format of documentation and photojournalism. Another thing that played a role in 35mm's popularity were the technological advancements associated with it. Throughout the mid-20th century, advancements in film technology improved the quality and versatility of 35mm film. Manufacturers introduced new emulsions, faster speed films, and improved color processes, making 35mm film capable of capturing high-quality images for both amateurs and professionals. It was these advancements that helped further boost its popularity. It was nice to know later on that even though you were carrying a small compact body, you were going to get great quality images because the emulsions were so good. And also, it can't be stated enough the accessibility and affordability of 35mm film. Compared to larger formats like medium and large format, 35mm film was affordable and accessible. It allowed a broader range of photographers to experiment with film photography without the need for expensive equipment or extensive technical knowledge. This accessibility contributed to its widespread adoption. Over time, 35mm film became the standard format for both amateur and professional photographers, and it remained dominant until the digital revolution in the late 20th century. In this next part of the video, Fujifilm is going to enter the chat. beginning with their introduction to the global photographic film industry in 1930 to the release of their latest cameras, lenses, and technology today. Fujifilm was founded in 1934 in Tokyo, Japan. It was established as a joint venture between the government-owned Ministry of Finance and several private sector companies. The company's original focus was on the manufacture of photographic film, but eventually they would expand into many other industries. At the time, Japan's domestic film industry was relatively small and underdeveloped compared to the major foreign film manufacturers like Agfa and Kodak. The government saw the establishment of a domestic film company as a way to promote the growth of the domestic film industry and to reduce Japan's dependence on foreign manufacturers. Additionally, the joint venture between the government and private sectors was established to provide the new company with the necessary capital and technical expertise required to produce such technologically advanced materials. Fujifilm was created with a vision of providing photographers and customers high-quality products and services. As I said a second ago, the company's initial focus was on the production of film, but quickly that expanded to other offerings such as cameras, photo finishing equipment, and even medical supplies. The company's very first color film they developed, and that was Fujifilm Fujichrome. Fujichrome was a slide reversal film, but eventually Fujifilm's film portfolio would expand to include other offerings such as black and white films and also some color negative films. Some of their more popular films over the years, Fujifilm Neopan, and as we know it today, Fuji Neopan Acros 2, and is still replicated by film simulations on their digital cameras. The film was known for its fine grain and high sharpness. One of Fujifilm's more popular products over the years, Ken Rockwell's favorite, and a film that I like so well that I made it its very own video, is Fujifilm Velvia. This is a derivative of the original Fujifilm Fujichrome, and Fujifilm Velvia is a high-quality, fine-grained slide film that was released in 1990, and this was a film that was popular among amateurs and professionals alike for its really high saturation, really high sharpness, and the wonderful landscapes you could get from this film. All in all, Fujifilm Velvia provided excellent image quality. And as I pointed out earlier, Fujifilm also developed and manufactured photo finishing equipment such as film processors and enlargers to support the use of its film. In the early years, the company faced intense competition from established foreign companies, but it was able to overcome that by focusing on quality and innovation. Fujifilm developed new types of film and new manufacturing processes which helped differentiate itself from its foreign competitors, like I said, Agfa and Kodak. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, there was this little thing that happened, World War II, but towards the mid to late 1950s, Fujifilm had found its footing once more and was back on the path to success. It had become, once again, one of the world's leading producers of photographic film. As part of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, the U.S. dropped a significant number of bombs on major Japanese cities, including Tokyo, where Fujifilm's factories were located. However, with the help of government policies and the hard work of its employees, it was able to recover and once again become the world's leading producer of photographic film. And I would be remiss at this point to not talk about Fuji's long-standing battles with Kodak. Fujifilm and Kodak had a long history of competition in the photographic film marketplace. When Fujifilm was first established in 1934, it faced intense competition because Kodak was the world's leading manufacturer of film. In order to compete with Kodak, Fujifilm had to spend a lot of time working on competing manufacturing processes. The company invested heavily in research and development to improve the quality of its film and develop new types of film that were not available from other manufacturers. Fujifilm and Kodak would battle intensely through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, until the onset of digital photography. Eventually, the onset of digital photography would lead to Kodak filing for bankruptcy in 2012. Fujifilm did a much better job adapting to the changes in the marketplace and continued to thrive. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Fujifilm diversified its product portfolio and started manufacturing cameras. One of the more popular sub-brands that Fujifilm produced was their own brand, Fujica, and it manufactured film cameras under this name from the 1960s until the 2000s. It included a wide range of models from basic point-and-shoot cameras to advanced SLRs. The Fujica ST801, a single-lens reflex camera, was one of the most popular film cameras in that line. The Fujica Single 8 was an 8mm movie camera that was released in 1965. It was a popular camera for home movies, and it was well known for its ease of use and compact size. The Fujica AZ1, this was a 35mm point-and-shoot camera that was released in the 1980s. It was known for its compact size and automatic metering system. The Fujica AX5, this was a 35mm SLR camera that was released in the 1980s. It was a popular choice among many amateur and professional photographers. This camera was known for its advanced features and its exceptional image quality. And the Fujica GS645, with 645 in its name, should come as no surprise that this was a 645 medium format camera. This camera was released in the 1980s, and it was popular among professional photographers who wanted that additional image quality that medium format could provide. Fujifilm has continued to manufacture and research films even to today, but there have been many popular films made by Fujifilm that have already been discontinued, such as Fujifilm Fujichrome Astia. This was a color reversal film that was released in the early 1980s. It's known for its excellent skin tones and color reproduction. It's widely used by professional photographers and enthusiasts. There's also Fujifilm Fujicolor Superior. This was a consumer-grade color-negative film that was released in the early 1990s. It was widely used for everyday photography, the kind of stuff that you would pick out, take to a Little League game, take on vacation with your family. It was known for its very good color reproduction and exceptionally low cost. And our dearly departed Fujifilm Pro 400H. This was a popular professional-grade color-negative film that Fujifilm only recently announced was discontinued. This film was very popular because of its subtle, blue-shifted, wonderful color reproduction. Wedding photographers would buy it to medium format film systems just to be able to shoot weddings on this film stock. And as the market began to decline into the digital era, Fujifilm didn't go the way of Kodak, and Fujifilm began developing their own digital camera system. Today, Fujifilm continues to be a major player in the global imaging market. With a wide range of products and a strong reputation for quality and innovation, Fujifilm continued to adapt by developing digital cameras and other imaging products such as photo printers, digital photo frames, and software for image management and editing. The company also diversified into other areas such as medical imaging equipment, such as X-ray machines, and graphic arts equipment, such as large format printers. There were a number of instant films throughout the history of film photography, but there was only one that became so ubiquitous that it became the generic term for the entire industry. The Polaroid Corporation was and continues to be a legendary name in the world of film photography. It's played a pioneering role in the development of photographic technology for over 8 decades. Edwin Herbert Land was a brilliant American scientist and inventor who in 1926 dropped out of Harvard University to pursue his vision of creating a polarizing material. Land's big breakthrough came in 1929 when he invented the world's first practical polarizing material. Many of us photographers know, love, and are well familiar with the effects that a polarizing material can give. Cuts down glare, it allows you to see into the top of water, cuts the glare off the top of the water. Polarizer has an almost magical quality to it. It was this invention that attracted interest from other folks in the photography space and really set the stage for Land's future innovations. In 1929, Land founded Land Wheelwright Laboratories in New York City, and he was able to do this because of the financial support of his former Harvard physics instructor, George Wheelwright III. As you might have been able to have guessed at this point, the lab focused on the research and the development of polarizing materials. Within a year of the formation of the company, Land had invented a polarizing film that was able to be used in glasses, camera lenses, and other optical devices to cut down on glare and the other optical effects we talked about. Land had received a patent for this polarizing material, which he called Polaroid. And as one might expect, it being the first practical polarizing material, this material was sought after by many industries, including eyewear, optics, and those sorts of things. In 1937, Land officially founded the Polaroid Corporation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His goal with the Polaroid Corporation was to explore new applications for the Polaroid material. Land's company started manufacturing sunglasses and other optical products, and eventually found some success in these endeavors. The most iconic and revolutionary invention usually associated with Polaroid is their invention of instant film photography. And anybody even a little bit familiar with Polaroid's history will recall a conversation that Land allegedly had with his daughter. After taking some photographs, Land's daughter was curious as to why she couldn't see her images immediately after they were taken. And that was what sparked Land's interest in creating instant photographs. After years of research and development, the world's first practical instant film camera would be brought to market in 1948. It was called the Polaroid Land camera. The Polaroid Land camera was a game changer in photography at the time. The camera used self-developing film. Users would take the camera, take it out, take some shots, and then watch the images develop in real time right before their eyes. This allowed the users to experience that wonderful sense of instant gratification, and the wide world of instant photography was born. And it didn't take long after that for Polaroid cameras to become a cultural phenomenon. What was so special about Polaroid's film was it contained all the development chemicals inside the film. And the way that this would work is after a user had taken a photo, the user would press down a lever, which would cause the film to slide through some rollers, which would squeeze the chemicals into the film, distribute them evenly, and allow the image to then be developed. And it should come as no surprise that these cameras were known for their ease of use. It eliminated the need for external darkrooms, development, all this other stuff that usually came along with photography at the time. And it was that immediacy, that instant gratification that made these cameras so appealing to amateurs and casual users. And as I said previously, the Polaroid Land camera then became a cultural phenomenon. Folks all around the world would know that iconic square format, the one that persists with us even to today through things like Instagram. Almost every family photo album from that era has Polaroid stuck in it somewhere. And after the Polaroid Land camera, Polaroid would continue to innovate, announcing new cameras and integrating new features and technology as time would go on. Eventually, Polaroid would release their iconic SX70 camera and the widely used 600 series. It was those innovations and these cameras that cemented Polaroid's legacy in photographic history. You can't really tell the story of photography's popularization without telling the story of the SLR. And that was one of the biggest advancements to come along since the Leica rangefinder. The Barnack Leica rangefinders were the first popular 35mm cameras, but a new design provided a number of advancements that would help accelerate the popularity of photography. SLRs are a type of camera that uses a mirror and a prism system to allow the photographer to see exactly what the camera sees through the viewfinder at the moment it's happening. The term single lens reflex refers to the fact that the camera uses a single lens for composing the image and taking the photograph. Duh. No, I'm just kidding. The first 35mm SLR prototype was the SLR Filmonka, developed in 1931 in the Soviet Union. In 1933, A.O. Galar developed the Gelvita, also in the USSR. It was later renamed some Cyrillic letters, also called the Sport, but the Sport version of the camera didn't hit the market until 1937. Early 35mm SLR cameras had functionality that was similar to larger models, with a waist-level finder, ground glass viewfinder, and a mirror that remained in the taking position and blacked out the viewfinder after an exposure, and then returned when the film was wound on. Innovations that transformed the SLR were the Pentaprism eye-level viewfinder and the instant return mirror. The mirror flipped up briefly during exposure, immediately returning to the viewfinding position. The half-silvered, fixed pellicle mirror, without even the brief blackout of the instant return mirror, was also innovative, but it did not become standard. Through-the-lens metering was another important advance. As electronics advanced, so did new functionality, and we'll continue discussing that. While we've talked about some of the early prototype SLRs, the first commercial SLR was the Exacta, produced in 1936 in Germany, which was a fundamentally scaled-down version of the Vest Pocket Exacta. The camera used a waist-level viewfinder. Various other models were produced, such as the King Exacta, the Exacta II, and the Exacta Varex. The Exacta sold well and triggered other camera manufacturers to develop 35mm SLRs. Sales were particularly strong in the medical and scientific fields. A large range of lenses and accessories were made by a variety of manufacturers, turning the camera into the first system camera. That brings us to the humorously named Rectiflex. The Rectiflex was the name of an Italian camera maker from 1947 to 1958, and it was the name of their sole model. The Rectiflex was a 35mm SLR camera with a focal plane shutter, interchangeable lenses, and a pentaprism eye-level viewfinder. The Rectiflex, followed by the Contax S, was the first SLR camera introducing the modern pentaprism eye-level viewfinder, a feature that would become critical to the success and the convenience of 35mm photography. The first prototype Rectiflex was introduced in 1947, with final presentation in 1948 and the start of the series of production in September of the same year, thus hitting the market 1 year before the Contax S. Continuing on, that brings us back to Zeiss. Zeiss had begun work on a 35mm SLR camera in 1936. The camera used an eye-level pentaprism. One thing that Zeiss did to brighten up the image, they included a Fresnel lens between the ground glass screen and the pentaprism. This design principle became the conventional SLR design used even to today. World War II intervened, and the Zeiss SLR did not emerge as a production camera until Zeiss and the newly created factory in East Germany introduced the Contax S in 1949, the production ending in 1951. The Italian Rectiflex Series 1000 went in production the year before, in September of 1948, thus being market-ready 1 year before the Contax. Both the Contax S and the Rectiflex were both progenitors of what we would think of as the modern SLR camera. It wouldn't be just the Europeans working on SLR cameras, though. Oh no. There were also some folks in Japan hard at work trying to create modern SLR-type cameras. That brings us to the rise of the Japanese SLRs. The earliest Japanese SLR for roll film was perhaps the Baby Superflex Baby, a 127 camera made by Umimoto and distributed by Kikoto in 1938. This camera had a leaf shut, but 2 years later came the Shinkaflex, a 6x6 camera made by Yoshimita Shikoi, with a focal plane shutter and interchangeable lenses. However, Japanese camera makers concentrated on rangefinder and twin lens reflex cameras, similar to the Western camera makers. The Asahi Optical Company ended up taking a different path in manufacturing, inspired by the German SLRs. Its first model, the Asahi Flex, existed to prototype form in 1951 and production in 1952, making it the first Japanese-built SLR camera. The Asahi Flex 2B in 1954 was the first Japanese SLR camera with an instant return mirror. Previously, the mirror would remain up and the viewfinder black until the user pressed the shutter button. In 1957, the Asahi Pentax became the first Japanese fixed pentaprism SLR. It successfully led Asahi to eventually rename itself Pentax. This was the first SLR to use the right-handed single-stroke film advance lever of the Leica M3 of 1954 and the Nikon S2 of 1955. At the time, Asahi and many other camera makers used the M42 lens mount found on the Contax S. Another company that introduced a notable SLR camera was Yashica. The Yashica company introduced its own SLR in 1959, the Penamatic. It was an advanced, modern 35mm SLR camera with a proprietary bayonet mount. The Pentamatic featured an automatic stop-down diaphragm, offered only with the Auto Yashinon 50mm 1.8 lens, instant return mirror, a fixed pentaprism, and mechanical focal plane shutter with speeds up to 1/1000th of a second. The camera also featured an interchangeable lens mount. There were a couple of notable cameras that we've not touched on yet, one of the most important ones being the Nikon F. The Nikon F model, introduced in 1959 as the world's first system camera, if the commercially unsuccessful Practina was not considered. The camera became enormously successful and was the camera design that demonstrated the superiority of the SLR of the Japanese camera manufacturers. This camera was the first SLR system that was adopted and used seriously by the general population of professional photographers, especially by those photographers covering the Vietnam War, and those news photographers utilizing motor-driven Nikon S with 250 exposure backs to record various launches of the space capsules in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space programs. With the introduction of the cheaper Nikon F, those more expensive rangefinder options out there from the Germans became less desirable. It was a combination of design elements in the Nikon F that made it successful. It featured interchangeable prisms and focusing screens. The camera had a depth of field preview button that had a mirror lockup capability. It featured a large bayonet mount and a large lens release button, a single-stroke ratcheted film advance lever, a titanium foil focal plane shutter, various types of flash synchronization, a rapid rewind lever, and a fully removable back. It was well made, extremely durable, and adhered closely to the then current successful design scheme of the Nikon rangefinder cameras, so that translated to ease of use for those who were familiar with their existing cameras. And this is something Nikon's always done well with over their history, keeping the functionality of their cameras rather coherent. Instead of the M42 mount used by Pentax and other manufacturers, Nikon devised their own proprietary lens mount. Nikon had introduced the 3-claw F bayonet mount lens system, which is still in use in its modified form even today. The focal plane shutter, unlike the other SLRs of the period which used a cloth material for the focal plane shutter, used titanium foil which was rated for 100,000 cycles. Unlike most of the other manufacturers involved in the 35mm camera production, The Nikon F was released with a full range of lenses ranging from 21mm to 1000mm focal length. Nikon was also among the first to introduce what is commonly known today as mirror lenses which used catadioptric lens design, and thus yielded lens designs that were more compact than the standard telephoto designs. Subsequent top-of-the-line Nikon models carried the F series, with the Nikon F6 the last film SLR flagship from Nikon. Another important camera and manufacturer that must be noted is Canon. In May of 1959, the Canaflex SLR was introduced. The camera featured a quick return mirror and had an automatic diaphragm. It was introduced with an interchangeable back pentaprism housing, and it featured newly developed R-series breech lock mount lenses. The SLR was superseded by the Canaflex RM, a fixed prism SLR which featured a built-in selenium cell meter. Later came the Canaflex R2000 with a top shutter speed of 0.002 of a second. In 1962, the FL series lenses were introduced, along with the new camera body, the Canon FX, which had a built-in CDS light meter positioned on the front left side of the camera, a design which appeared much like the Minolta SR7. Another company that was important to the development of the SLR camera was Olympus and their Pen F. The Olympus Pen F series was introduced and produced by Olympus of Japan between 1963 and 1966. The system consisted of the original Pen F, later behind-the-lens metering Pen FT from 1966 to 1972, and the non-meter version of the FT known as the Olympus Pen FV, which was manufactured from 1967 to 1970. The design considerations used were unusual. The camera produced half-frame 35mm negatives. It used a poro-prism as a design replacement for the conventional pentaprism, thus producing the flat-top appearance, and the view from the viewfinder was a portrait orientation, unlike standard 35mm SLRs which were in landscape orientation. The half-frame cameras were also exceptional for use of the rotary shutter rather than traditional horizontally traveling focal plane shutter, commonly used in other SLR designs. The cameras were produced with various interchangeable lenses as well. The smaller image format made the Pen F system one of the smallest SLR camera systems ever made. Only the Pentax Auto 110 was smaller, but that Pentax system was much more limited in range and the image quality was not as good. The coming decades would be punctuated by more and more electronic features being packed into these SLR camera designs and the build-out of a number of complete camera systems. The most important feature for many of us, me included, is auto metering. Photographers during the 1940s and the 1950s preferred the use of handheld light meters, such as the Weston or the GE Selenium light meters, or others that were common at the time. Provided good analog readouts of shutter speeds, apertures, ASA, now known as ISO, and EV. Selenium cells, however, could easily be judged for their light sensitivity by simply looking at the size of the cell's metering surface. A small surface meant it was lacking in low light sensitivity. These would prove to be very useful for light metering. Built-in light metering with SLR cameras started with clip-on selenium light meters. One such meter was made for the Nikon F, which was coupled to the shutter speed dial and the aperture ring. While the selenium cell area was big, the add-on made the camera look clumsy and unattractive. In order for built-on light metering to be successful in SLR cameras, the use of cadmium sulfide cells, CDS cells, was imperative. Some early SLRs featured built-in CDS meter, usually on the front left side of the top plate, as in the Minolta SR7. Other manufacturers such as the Miranda and the Nikon introduced the CDS prism, which fitted to the interchangeable prism SLR cameras. Nikon's early photomic finder used a cover in which the front cell was raised and the reading was taken, and the photographer would either turn the coupled shutter dial and or the coupled aperture ring to the center of the galvanometer. Further advances in CDS sensitivity, however, were needed, as CDS cells suffered from memory effect. That is, if exposed to bright sunlight, the cell would require many minutes to return to normal operation and sensitivity, which would be problematic if you're trying to use it in bright sunlight. You can't be waiting a couple minutes before your shot most of the time. Eventually, we got away from the clip-on meters and we got through-the-lens metering. Through-the-lens metering measures the light that comes through the camera lens, thus eliminating much of the potential for error inherent in separate light meters. It is particular advantage with long telephoto lenses, macro photography, and photomicrography. First SLRs with through-the-lens metering were introduced by the Japanese manufacturers in the early to mid-1960s. One of the most significant designs of the 1970s for the 35mm SLR camera industry was the introduction of Olympus OM1 in 1973. After experiencing the success with their small Olympus Pen half-frame cameras that we spent some time talking about, Olympus set out with its chief designer, Yoshihisa Mitani, to later create a compact SLR, the M1, with its new compact lenses and large bayonet mount that accept almost any SLR design optic. Shortly after being launched, the camera was renamed the OM1 to avoid a trademark conflict with Leica. The mechanical manual OM1 was significantly smaller and lighter than contemporary SLRs, but no less functional. The camera was supported by one of the most comprehensive 35mm SLR lens and accessory systems available. Mitani described the size and the weight by totally redesigning the SLR from the ground up with unprecedented use of metallurgy, which included repositioning the shutter speed selector to the front of the lens mount instead of the more conventional position on the top of the camera body. One of the most important milestones of the 1970s SLRs came from the Canon A1. The camera released in 1978, and it was the first SLR with a programmed auto exposure mode. Although the Minolta XD11 was the first camera to offer both aperture priority and shutter priority modes in 1977, it was not until the next year that the A1 came out with its microprocessor computer powerful enough to offer both of those modes and add the ability to automatically set both the shutter speed and the lens aperture in a compromise exposure from the light meter. Programmed auto exposure and its various iterations became a standard feature by the mid-1980s. The next important feature, and another one that I really love, is autofocus. Autofocus compact cameras had been introduced in the late 1970s. The SLR market at the time was crowded, and autofocus seemed an excellent option to attract novice photographers and get them shooting more expensive, nicer, upscale cameras. The first 35mm SLR with autofocus capability was the Pentax MEF that came out in 1981. Also in 1981, Canon introduced a self-contained autofocus lens, the 35mm to 70mm AF, which contained an optical triangulation system that would focus the lens on the subject exact center when a button on the side of the lens was pushed. It would work with any Canon FD camera body. Nikon's F3 AF was a highly specialized autofocus camera. It was the variant of the Nikon F3 that worked with a full range of Nikon manual focus lenses, but it also featured two dedicated AF lenses, an 80mm and a 200mm. And both of those lenses coupled with the special AF viewfinder. Nikon's later AF cameras and lenses used an entirely different design. These cameras and other experimentations in autofocus had very limited success, but that was all about to change. The Minolta Maximum with 2X's 7000. What an awesome name. The first true 35mm SLR autofocus camera that had a successful design was the Minolta Dynax Maxim 7000. The camera was introduced in 1985. This SLR featured a built-in motor drive and dedicated flash capability. Minolta also used a completely new bayonet mount lens system, the Maximum AF lens system, which currently is masking around as the Sony A mount system, in which the lens's focusing action was driven from a motor inside the camera body. This reduced the complexity of the camera body and the lens. Canon responded with a T80 and a range of 3 motor-equipped AC lenses, but this was regarded as a stopgap move. Nikon introduced the N2020, known in Europe as the F501, which was their first SLR system with a built-in autofocus motor, and redesigned autofocus auto Nikkor lenses. Nikon's AF lenses, however, remained compatible with older Nikon 35mm SLR cameras. The older manual focus Nikon lenses could be used with varying degrees of compatibility on the new AF cameras. Canon followed Minolta in introducing a new lens mount system, which was incompatible with their previous mount systems, the EOS, electro-optical system. Unlike Minolta's motor and body approach, this design located the motor within the lens. Now, more compact motor designs meant that both the focus and aperture could be driven electronically without motor bulges in the lenses. The Canon EF lens mount has no mechanical linkages. All communication between the body and the lens is electronic. Nikon and Pentax would quickly follow suit, but they would both choose to continue their existing lens mounts. That's why we had Nikon F-mount lenses even until just a few years ago. They were able to retrofit their lens mounts into having autofocus capability. This allowed both camera systems to retain the ability to shoot their old camera lenses, but their newer bodies would have the ability to autofocus as well. It's kind of a best of both worlds approach. Later, Nikon added silent wave motor mechanisms into its lenses, supporting both focusing schemes until the introduction of the entry-level Nikon D40 and the D40X in 2006. Major 35mm camera manufacturers, Canon, Minolta, Nikon, and Pentax, were among the few companies to transition successfully to autofocus. Other camera manufacturers also introduced functionally successful autofocus SLR systems, but the systems on the whole weren't successful. It was this technological race forward that would drive many manufacturers out of the SLR market entirely.
There's a place where the value can't be beaten. There's the famous Polaroid Supercolor 635. Snap it, see it, and save at just $65. Polaroid
Kodak has now created the tomato.
Wow, look at that! Turn it into a camera!
Kodak tomato.
Every family should have one.
Well, not before.
Just push.
The autofocus, auto flash, auto everything Nikon One Touch. Now everyone can take great pictures.
Say cheese! Cheese! Norman! Trevor!
Say cheese.
Fingers?
Just a few words about peak film photography before we start to talk about the collapse. Most of us of a certain age remember our parents walking around with SLR cameras or film cameras of some sort, and many of us might have even used film cameras ourselves. I know when I was growing up, I had a 110 camera that I loved to shoot. The peak of film photography is often considered to be in the late 20th century, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, and even in the 1990s. During this period, film photography was the dominant and widely adopted medium for capturing images, both by amateur enthusiasts and professional photographers. Several factors contributed to the peak of film photography during this time. But what was it that eventually drove film photography from the top? Well, that would be the advent of digital cameras and digital camera technology. And you might be surprised to learn who actually invented digital cameras. One of the craziest stories in the entire history of photography is the fact that Kodak actually invented digital photography and then just decided to ignore it. Yes, in June of 1973, Steve Sasson graduated with a master's degree and landed his very first job at Kodak. Kodak was not typically hiring electrical engineers, they were hiring chemical engineers and mechanical engineers, because that's what cameras were, of course. They were mechanical and they relied on films, which was chemicals, and there's not a lot of use for an electrical engineer in any of those products. It became pretty clear that the bulk of the unit cost of manufacturing of consumer cameras was going to be electronic and electrical components, like film advances, exposure controls, and flash controls. All these were being implemented electronically, putting a new emphasis on hiring electrical engineers, so that's why they hired a guy like Steve. Sasson started work at the Applied Research Laboratory in the Apparatus Division. The laboratory was involved with anything to do with the equipment and had a far-ranging charter. That meant they could do kind of whatever they wanted to do. They were free to experiment. It helped to resolve technical problems and research new ideas. One day, Sasson's boss came up to him with a proposal, and Sasson had this to say. He was leaning against the file cabinet in my office while offering me a choice between two projects to work on when I was between jobs, says Sasson. He said, you could do modeling for our exposure control for XL movie cameras, or look at this new charge coupled device. I'm curious to see how it works and what we can do with this. Sasson went on to say, I was in the electronics group, and I was an electrical engineer, and this is a new type of device that we had never worked with before. It had to do with two-dimensional exposure surface, much like film, but it was all electronic. I said, I would be interested in working on the charge coupled device based on my experience at college, he said. His boss replied, great. Go along and play with it and see if you can get anything useful or what we might be able to do with it. For background, a charge couple device are three letters that many of you, especially you digicam enthusiasts, have probably heard of. CCD. It's an integrated circuit containing an array of charged capacitors, one that along with CMOS has become widely used as digital camera imaging sensors. Sasson went to work feverishly on the CCD and created a crude, largish representation of a digital camera. Sasson went on to say this, he said, I stole the lens from our used parts bin on the manufacturing floor of the XL movie cameras, explained Sasson. Because the Super 8 movie format was larger than the active area of a CCD, I could place this film plane of an XL movie camera assembly, and it would work. The camera that he created was ahead of its time. It only had an electronic shutter, not a mechanical shutter, and the camera only came fitted with one exposure speed, and that was 1/20th of a second. The camera also featured an infrared blocking screen on the front of the camera because apparently the CCD that they had made was very sensitive to infrared light. Sasson also added a tape assembly, although he had thought of building a memory card to record the image, and it became functional in December of 1975. The digital camera was invented at that point. Sasson had made his major discovery almost within 2 years of starting work at Kodak, and no one in the building had any idea what they had just achieved. And this is what Sasson had to say. The reaction I got from Kodak management was one of curiosity and skepticism, as it didn't feel like a major invention, says Sasson. There was no real feeling that we had invented something. The feeling was that it was a very scary look at what could be possible in the future. And the company's entire business model was focused around sensitized goods, film, proposing that they not use any of that was not popular. In other words, Kodak was hesitant to cannibalize any of its film market. Sasson said he would walk around with this crazy-looking camera. It was about the size of a toaster, but he could hold it. Sasson said, I took pictures of people in the room before I said anything, and then I took out the tape of the digital information that was stored on, and I put it in the playback unit when a picture popped up on the TV screen, and that generally got everyone's attention. Indeed, they didn't ask me how it worked, Sasson says. They simply asked me why anybody would want to take a picture this way when there was nothing wrong with the conventional photography. Nobody was asking me to develop this camera. In fact, nobody even knew I was developing the camera. So in the dialogue, in those meetings, in the spring and summer and the winter of 1976, centered around whether this could be a viable form of photography. What would it take to require it to get there? We probably had some of the most in-depth digital photography discussions in that conference room in 1976. Kodak management may have been reluctant to dive headfirst into digital photography, but Sasson himself continued down the rabbit hole that would one day become the most ubiquitous way to take photographs ever in history. Sasson said, "I was fascinated with the idea of filmless photography and that I wouldn't have to use consumables to take photos. I worked in digital photography from that day in 1975 until I retired, so I've worked in digital photography longer than anybody, which has motivated me a lot." The young inventor was asked at the time when he thought this would be viable for consumers, and he said, "Of course, I don't know. You get desperate when you ask questions that you cannot answer. I called the research labs and asked them how many pixels needed to make an equivalent film of 110 photograph. It was the worst consumer format that I could picture, so I went for the lowest level. They said 1,000,000 pixels, so 2,000,000 if you want color. I used Moore's law to come up with 15 to 20 years. It turned out not to be a bad prediction for all the wrong reasons. I didn't know that everything would happen in between, but we launched our first digital camera 18 years later, so wasn't a bad prediction, just really a lucky one. The size of those first pictures was 10,000 pixels. And I don't mean 10,000 by 10,000, I mean 100 by 100. The images were recorded on Philips 300-foot cassette tapes. Typically, only 2 photos were saved on each tape, but they could have stored about 30 in terms of length and density. But you quickly run out of tape, so they are erased and reused. It was an ongoing experiment, consistently trying to improve the quality. They were not thinking of some historical milestone. Their main concern was to make the work better and faster. Sometimes the camera would not work, mainly because the CCD is unstable. The photo, it was presumed then, would have been viewed on an electronic screen, which was a TV screen. And I mean, you have to think about the time. Folks weren't walking around with cell phones, laptops, all their different electronic devices. Who would really want to view an image on a TV screen, especially a big cathode TV? Prints had been with us for 100 years at that point, and it was already a great way to preserve and save photos. Steve went on to say this, "There's a lot of pushback on it, which I thought was odd because we had the slide business of people sitting down and looking at slides projected on the wall, but that didn't make much of a difference." All these years later, Sasson bemoans the fact that Kodak missed the boat when it could have seized the first mover advantage in digital cameras. "I was sad about Kodak filing for bankruptcy. I saw it coming, and Kodak had a resistant attitude towards it. For obvious reasons, they couldn't make nearly the money from digital that they had made with conventional photography, and I saw this for many years. I retired from Kodak in 2009 because I thought they would probably go away. I didn't want them to, but it was just looking that way. I could just see that there could have been a different outcome if they had just taken a different approach. Again, it's tough, and it's very hard to accept that change in your fundamental business model." So that's right. All the conclusion of this segment is that Steve Sasson, when he worked at Kodak, invented digital photography. He presented it to the higher-ups, and they weren't really interested in it. And unfortunately, Kodak eventually paid the price for that decision, as they would be behind the 8 ball for years as digital photography stormed forward and they were stuck in the past. Digital photography had been conceptualized in the 1950s, and Kodak had a successful implementation in the 1970s, but it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that things really started to heat up for digital photography. The 1980s saw the emergence of the first commercially available digital cameras. The Sony Mavica in 1981 used a CCD to capture images on a mini-disc. Talking a little bit more about the Sony Mavica. The name Mavica is an acronym for Magnetic Video Camera. The cameras were distinctive because they stored images digitally on a 3.5-inch floppy disk. The Mavica played a significant role in the transition from film photography into digital photography. This was the first time we had something that looked like the complete package. Another big offering from one of the mainstays of film photography was a camera by Fuji, and that was called the Fuji DS-1P. The DS-1P marked a notable step in the evolution of digital imaging technology. The DS-1P used a 16mm CCD, and again, we talked about that with Kodak. It's a charge coupled device imaging sensor. The resolution was a whopping 0.3 megapixels. And while that seems like not a lot of resolution today, at the time, this was pretty earth-shattering. Instead of using film or a magnetic tape recording system, or even a disc like Sony was using at the time, the DS-1P used proprietary memory cards. These were the early forms of digital storage for capturing and storing images. The camera had a small optical viewfinder for composing shots. Additionally, it had a 1.5-inch LCD on the back for reviewing the images that you captured. A critical feature and something that we would all grow to know and love over the next 20 to 30 years. The DS-1P had a fixed lens with a focal length of 8.8 millimeters and had an aperture of 2.8. It wasn't interchangeable, reflecting the simpler design and more consumer-oriented approach of the DS-1P. camera featured autofocus capabilities, a significant advancement at the time. If you'll remember back to our description of the development of autofocus, autofocus was a pretty late implementation into film cameras. It had only really been successfully implemented since the 1970s and into the 1980s. So the fact that this new digital camera also featured autofocus, it was pretty groundbreaking at the time. The Fuji DS-1P, along with other early digital cameras, played a crucial role in paving the way for the digital imaging revolution. While its specification may seem modest by today's standard, its introduction marked a shift in the way people thought about capturing and sharing images. The DS1P, as a pioneering consumer digital camera, holds historical significance in the broader context of the development of digital photography. In the 1990s, that's when the market started to be flooded with consumer digital cameras for the very first time. In 1991, Kodak released the DCS100, the first commercially available digital SLR camera. However, it was quite expensive and targeted professionals at the time, and I call it a digital camera. It was kind of a weird boy. Taking a look at the DCS100, it was actually a customized camera back bearing the digital image sensor mounted on a Nikon F3 body and was released by Kodak in 1991. The company had previously shown it at Photokina in 1990. So while it was an important step on the way to, proper digital cameras, it made the Nikon F3 weird and chunky, and clearly there was more work to be done. Casio QV10 was also introduced in 1995, which represented more development along that same line. By the time the late 90s rolled around, we were getting increasingly compact digital cameras. They were no longer these big boxy outfits. The design constraints that were imposed by film were no longer present in a lot of these digital cameras. They could get by with using much smaller sensors and much smaller lens arrangements. Like I said, the late 90s saw a proliferation of compact digital cameras. The Sony CyberShot DSC F1 came out in 1996, along with the Nikon Coolpix 100 in 1997. Those are two names that are still with us today in some form. We started to see compact flash memory cards as well as smart media memory cards. By the time we rolled into the early 2000s, we were at the megapixel race, and we all remember these days the megapixels going from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, so on, so on, so on. The megapixel race was largely a way for camera manufacturers to market the subsequent models of these cameras over their predecessors. Everybody knew that if you got more megapixels, you got better images. It's very easy for consumers to understand. We had the Nikon Coolpix 990 in 1999, and we had the Canon PowerShot G1 in 2000, two very important digital cameras. I think my parents actually had a Canon PowerShot G1, and I can still remember the Maria Sharapova advertisements from the time. Whew. It was also at this time that digital cameras started to integrate some video capture capabilities as well, making them not just a stills imaging tool, but also a competent video camera. The mid-2000s witnessed the rise of digital single-lens reflex cameras and the introduction of mirrorless cameras. The Canon EOS 5D came out in 2005, and Nikon's D90 came out in 2008, and these were very significant, important DSLRs. In 2008, Panasonic came out with the Lumix G1, which was the first ever introduced mirrorless camera. And as we moved into the 2010s, almost every camera manufacturer was offering a mirrorless camera system, and the industry started to move away from the SLR design. And all of these things taken together led to what we would all consider the collapse of film photography. So at this point, things for film took a turn for the worse. You had this rapid technological advancement in the form of these digital cameras. The clunky, cumbersome process of shooting your film, developing your film, having to wait to get your images back was replaced by the instant gratification of digital cameras. The decline of digital photography was a gradual process that unfolded over several decades, marked by the rise of digital imaging technology. The narrative of the collapse of film photography involves a series of interconnected factors that led to the fading dominance of traditional film-based practices. And like we just said, the advent of digital cameras in the late 20th century marked a transformative moment for photography. Digital technology offered the promise of instant results, immediate feedback, and the ability to capture and store a vast amount of images without the need for physical film rolls. It took all the pain points of photography and significantly lessened them. It took a while for professionals to move to digital technology, but consumers were on board from the jump. For the casual point-and-shoot photographer, digital imaging was the way. And let's be honest, the first generations of digital cameras were pretty rough. They were low megapixel and expensive. And film photography maintained the image quality edge for a long time thereafter. But digital cameras rapidly evolved, with improvements in sensor technology, image processing, and resolution. The convenience of digital photography, combined with the features like autofocus, built-in flash, and various shooting modes, made them increasingly attractive to both amateur and professional photographers. Over time, the convenience of digital photography became a driving force. Instant previews on LCD screens and the ability to delete and retake photos and the elimination of film processing cost appealed to a broad audience. The immediacy of digital photography changed the way people approach and engage with the art of image making. The declining cost of digital cameras and the increasing availability of memory cards made digital photography more affordable to a wider demographic. This democratization of imaging technology was one of the primary driving factors moving people away from film and into digital. Film manufacturers were once giants in the industry, and they struggled to compete with the rapid advancements in digital technology. Companies like Kodak, which had played a central role in film photography for over a century, faced many financial challenges. The decline of film sales and the rise of digital imaging impacted the economic viability of film production, and before long, we would see film manufacturers dropping like flies. But there would be one last gasp at glory from film photography, and perhaps this is just something that was stuck in the pipeline at Fuji, and they went ahead and rushed it out. Either way, we can't understate the success of Fuji's last film format that they introduced, and that was Instax. The Fujifilm Instax line is a line of instant film cameras and instant film products that were developed by Fujifilm. The history and development of Instax trace the resurgence of instant photography in the digital age. I challenge you to go into any high school or any middle school and who has not used or seen somebody use an Instax camera. They're very prevalent. My daughter has one and she loves it. The Instax format and instant film in general can be traced all the way back to Polaroid. The concept of instant film photography dates back to Edwin Land, who created the Polaroid camera and founded the Polaroid Corporation. He introduced the first commercial instant film cameras in 1948. Fujifilm saw an opportunity to enter the instant photography market. Fujifilm began developing its own instant film technology and cameras. Fujifilm Instax line of cameras was first introduced in 1998. And the first format that they brought to market was the Instax Mini format, which is still with us today. The initial Instax cameras used a credit card-sized film format and became popular for their compact design and ease of use. That's why it took off. This was the ultimate casual camera for somebody who wanted instant results and still wanted that analog feel offered by film. But based on the success of the Instax Mini format, Fujifilm would eventually offer other film formats. They expanded the Instax line to include different formats, including larger Instax wide format. The availability of different film sizes allowed users to choose from the format that best suited their preferences. And as the years went on, Fujifilm Instax cameras and the format itself would see a number of technological advancements, including exposure controls, autofocus features, and creative shooting modes. And there would also be improvements to the emulsion that would make the images look better and better. The company continued to refine and enhance the user experience of shooting the Instax camera. And it's time we talk about the impact globally of Fujifilm's Instax line of cameras, and it can't be understated. Fujifilm in the photography market, they make most of their money through Instax cameras and the film for those cameras. We all love their GFX line, we all love their X series cameras, but it is Instax which makes them the most money, which is absolutely staggering. The Instax series gained widespread popularity globally, especially among a younger demographic. The appeal of instant prints in the digital age, as well as the retro and nostalgic aesthetic, contributed to the cultural impact of Instax. And we've talked about all manner of cameras in this video, but there is one particular camera, and perhaps the most important camera, and that's the camera that's most likely to be in your pocket right now, and that is the camera phone. And let's be clear, this section of this video could be its own colossal video in and of itself, just tracing the developments and advancements associated with camera phones. I've done my best to kind of be concise and only talk about some of the most significant advancements, but this is a lengthy section of the video because it's so darn important. Cameras and phones are ubiquitous. Few of us need to carry a dedicated device for taking photos anymore. And these days, looking at digital camera sales, the sales have fallen off a cliff. But how did we get here? Let's take a look at the history of camera phone development. The first camera phone was developed by Samsung and Sharp. The phone was released in South Korea in June of 2000. The SCH V200 flipped open to reveal a 1.5-inch TFT LCD, and the built-in digital camera was capable of taking 20 photos at 350,000 pixel resolution. Man, look at all those pixels. That is 0.35 megapixels for those keeping score at home. An actual potato. But the kicker was you had to connect your phone to your computer to get the photos off. Unfortunately, the times haven't changed that much. The camera and phone components were essentially separate devices housed in the same body. The first United States camera phone was developed by Sanyo, and here's a photo taken with that device. The SCP-5300. It was in November of 2002 before the US adopted the crazy Japanese trend of putting cameras in phones with the Sanyo SCP-5300 from Sprint. It cost about $400 when it was released and featured a chunky clamshell design. This camera as well featured a 0.35 megapixel sensor. Pictures that you're going to see in this video come from this old IGN review of the device. The Sanyo SCP-5300 had a basic flash, white balance control, a self-timer, digital zoom, and various filter-like effects, sepia, black and white, and all that kind of stuff. But by the end of 2003, camera phones were really taking off in the United States, and this was clearly going to be a thing. And by that point in 2003, almost 80 million devices had been sold worldwide. Digital Trends reported at the time that camera phones rivaled DVD player sales back in November of 2003. The good news for consumers was that with each iteration of a camera phone, it seemed like the quality was getting better, and also prices were dropping. 1.3 megapixels arrived with the AudioVox PM8920, and continuing on the camera phone trend, Sprint released that camera in July of 2004. It was the first phone in the US to feature a 1.3 megapixel camera capable of capturing a 1280 by 960 pixel resolution shot. Not only could you share those photos wirelessly, but the images are actually good enough where you could print them as well, as long as the prints didn't get too big. It had a dedicated camera button and had a variety of different settings, including a multi-shot option for taking 8 quick photos in a row. The ability to record your own shutter sound. It was available at the time for $150 with rebates, or about $299 without all the fancy rebates. By the end of 2004, the camera phone was riding high. Canalys reported that over half the phones sold worldwide in the first 9 months of 2004 had cameras in them, and the 2/3 of all phones shipped within the third quarter were camera phones. Leading the way was the Finnish manufacturer Nokia. In 2005, the Nokia N90 landed to take the camera phone to new heights, all of 2 megapixels of heights. Not only did the camera boast a 2 megapixel camera, like we just said, but it also had fancy Carl Zeiss optics, which you've already heard in this video quite a bit. Camera phone will probably be best remembered for its rotating screen, because you could do things like this. Gave it kind of a camcorder feel. But eventually one of the most prominent names in photography and electronics in general would weigh in, and that was Sony. The main competitor for the Nokia in terms of the camera arms race was the Sony Ericsson. Carrying Sony's CyberShot digital camera branding, there were quite a few decent releases intended to steal Nokia's camera phone crown. The Sony Ericsson K800i came out in 2006. The phone featured a whopping 3.2 megapixel imaging sensor. The phone also had autofocus and image stabilization, which was pretty darn nice. Nokia would then retaliate with their own version of a 3.2 megapixel camera phone. This was the Nokia N73. This camera phone came out in 2007. And we've talked a lot about camera phones in this video at this point, but there's been one name that you haven't heard, and that is Apple. As an American and as an iPhone user, it'd be hard to make this video without talking about the good old iPhone. The iPhone is the first iPhone model and was the first smartphone designed and marketed by Apple. The phone was officially announced on January the 9th, 2007 in a famous Steve Jobs keynote speech. Take a look at this.
A phone and an internet communicator, an iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
I remember watching that live and being so excited. But as a freaking broke college student, no chance I could have seen an iPhone. But Apple's development of the iPhone product started back in 2005. The project continued in complete secrecy until the phone was unveiled. The device broke with the prevailing models of phone designs, eliminating most physical hardware buttons, and had finger-friendly touch controls, something that persists even today. Apple has done all they can to eliminate all the buttons on the phone, much to some people's delight, but much to my chagrin. As a camera user, I love my buttons. The original iPhone featured quad-band GSM cellular connectivity with GPRS and Edge support for data transfer. Anybody remember Edge? Man, that was some blazing fast stuff, right? Edge, you're on the Edge network. Just take my word for it, it sounds a lot better than it was. The phone also had continuous internet access and onboard processing to support features unrelated to voice communication. Its successor, the iPhone 3G, was announced on June the 9th, 2008. The iPhone 3G was the first iPhone that I owned. The iPhone would quickly become Apple's most successful product, with later generations of the phone and the sales from those devices propelling Apple to become one of the world's most profitable companies. The introduction of the App Store allowed established companies and startup developers to build careers and earn billions of dollars via the platform, while providing consumers new ways to access information and connect with other people. And I can remember the very first Christmas when the App Store came out, and just spending all of these iTunes cards that I'd gotten for Christmas on tons of video games for my iPhone. And that's something else that really isn't talked about enough, and we won't spend a lot of time on it here, is Apple's contributions to gaming. Apple really spawned a whole industry of mobile phone gaming at the time. I remember playing tons and tons of stuff, Angry Birds and like Clash of Clans, a lot of those OG iPhone games that still exist today in various forms. But the iPhone was really the originator of all those. Those touch controls, the vibrant screen, the constant online internet connectivity. It was those features that really made that type of gaming possible. The iPhone largely appealed to the general public, as opposed to the business community where BlackBerry and IBM focused on at the time. And it was by integrating existing technology and expanding on usability, the iPhone turned the smartphone industry on its head. But for our purposes, we didn't really talk much about the camera. The iPhone camera featured a 2-megapixel image sensor, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Another name that you all have heard a lot, and probably some of you guys have one of their phones as well, another operating system, the famous alternative to the iPhone, is the Android-operated smartphone. And to say the iPhone caught the smartphone industry with their pants down would be an understatement. None of the other companies at the time had anything ready to go to even come close to rivaling the iPhone. The first Android phone would come in 2008, and it looked antiquated even when it came out. The HTC Dream, known as the T-Mobile G1 in the United States, is a smartphone developed by HTC. It first released in September of 2008, the Dream was the first commercially released product to use the Linux-based Android operating system, which was purchased and further developed by Google and the Open Handset Alliance to create an open competitor to other major smartphone platforms at the time, such as Symbian, BlackBerry OS, and iPhone OS. The operating system offers a customizable graphical user interface, integration with Google services such as Gmail, a notification system that shows a list of recent messages from the apps, and the Android market, which was their rival to the App Store. The HTC Dream at the time would come with a 3.1 megapixel camera. As the iPhone continued to iterate on its design, there would be a large number of Android devices of varying shapes, forms, and sizes over the next few years. It would take some time for everyone but Apple to stumble onto the now familiar candy bar form factor that we all know and love. All phones now kind of just look like this. One notable phone that's worth talking about in this segment, though, is the Samsung Vibrant. This was the predecessor to the Galaxy line, and it featured the now iconic minimalist design. The Samsung Galaxy S would arrive in 2010, and it would feature a 5-megapixel camera. Today, now iPhones are approaching 40 megapixels and Androids have something similar. I think that's because they're all getting their sensors from the same places, but we won't dig too much into that in this video. We all carry these devices with us on a daily basis and they're indispensable parts of our daily routine. I think it's safe to say that most of the photography that happens in the world these days happens on one of these. But what have these fast and furious technological advancements in the smartphone industry meant for film cameras and digital cameras? Well, not good things. It isn't all bad news, though, at least as it relates to film photography. One of the most unexpected stories over the past couple of decades is the insane comeback of film photography. We've had photographic film with us for over 100 years. We've had a number of cameras and lenses and systems and all these different tools used to capture images on the medium. As the world rushed to transition from film to digital, that wiped out many film stocks, camera manufacturers, and labs. Many words, articles, and videos have been produced about the decline of film photography around the world. But over the past few years, it would seem that the reaper has also came for digital photography as well. According to Japan's Camera and Imaging Products Association, CIPA, digital camera sales plummeted nearly 90% between 2010 and 2019, with the COVID crisis only making things worse. But for those of us who indulge in the hobby, recent history has shown that film photography seems to be on the uptick. The relative fortunes of film and digital seem to have almost reversed. In the last 3 years, companies like Kodak, Fujifilm, and Harman Technology, which manufactures the popular Ilford photo black and white films, have been experiencing a comeback. Harman's marketing director had this to say: "We're seeing film growth of 5% year-on-year globally," says Giles Brandwith. Additionally, Dennis Albrick, president of Kodak Alaris Imaging, had this to say: "Our professional film sales have been increasing over the last 2 to 3 years." And I think that there are a number of reasons that we can attribute this to. I think one is just the growth of retro aesthetic stuff kind of in general. You can take one look around YouTube and you can see entire YouTube channels with millions of subscribers dedicated only to retro gaming consoles. I think we can't underestimate the appeal of nostalgia when we look at film cameras, and that desire for a more tangible, slower, analog experience. I think there's a real draw there. So over the past few years, film photography's been on a comeback, and that's good news. But what do the next few years hold? That's really hard to say. There have been some positive signs in the industry, with Harman recently announcing a brand new, completely in-house developed color film, along with each year other manufacturers also announcing new film stocks. At this point, we're continuing to get new film stock, and new film cameras are in development from a variety of companies. I think film photography these days looks a lot more like the record industry. Will film photography ever be the main mechanism of taking images for most people in the world? Absolutely not. Probably not in the cards. But can the niche continue on? I do believe so. With current-day digital cameras and the invention of smartphones, there has been one piece of technology which has really expanded the technological envelope of shooting pictures, and that's computational photography. Image quality continues to improve year over year with improvements to image sensors and lenses, but progress has slowed as engineers struggle to overcome the limits imposed on them by physics. You have a sensor size and you have X amount of light coming towards the sensor. There's only so much you can get out of a particular exposure. Sensor sizes are what they are, and pixels have been shrunk to impossibly small levels to gather more information from each splash of light. While progress has slowed with sensor development, someone must have wondered, what if we just sampled the data multiple times? The evolution of computational photography has been nothing short of revolutionary. From its humble beginnings in the early days of digital imaging to the sophisticated techniques employed today, computational photography has transformed the way we capture, process, and share images. Believe it or not, computational photography can be traced all the way back to the 1960s, when researchers began exploring the potential of digital imaging processing. Early pioneers like Thomas Wang and Azrael Rosenfeld laid the groundwork for many techniques we take for granted today, such as image enhancement, restoration, and compression. However, it wasn't until the advent of digital cameras in the 1990s that computational photography really began to take off. First digital cameras were bulky and expensive. Like we talked about the Sony Mavica and the offering from Panasonic, they were big and bulky and expensive. And at the time, they produced relatively low-quality images, 0.3 megapixels or something like that. However, they opened up the world of possibilities for researchers and engineers who quickly realized that digital images could be manipulated and enhanced using computational techniques. This led to a development of a wide range of algorithms and tools designed to improve image quality, reduce noise, and correct for various optical aberrations. Who here in this video remembers HDR? Well, I certainly do. It was one of the things that made me want to get into photography in the first place. Unfortunately, you'll never see any of those images on this channel because they were terrible. We all remember those insanely colorful, oversaturated HDR images. One of the most significant breakthroughs in computational photography came in the early 2000s with the development of high dynamic range imaging. HDR techniques allow photographers to capture a much wider range of light intensities than traditional cameras, resulting in images with greater detail and more accurate color reproduction. This was made possible by the development of advanced algorithms that can combine multiple exposures of the same scene in a single high-quality image. In recent years, computational photography has continued to evolve at a rapid rate, driven by advances in hardware and software. Today's smartphones, for example, this is something we touched on at the beginning of the video, employ computational photography techniques to enhance and increase the resolution of their images. These phones are equipped with powerful processors and sophisticated AI camera systems that can perform a wide range of computational tasks in real time. This has led to the development of a host of new technologies and features, such as panorama stitching, depth of field control, and computational zoom. Who here loves portrait mode? And also, several camera manufacturers have also successfully implemented computational techniques. My first encounter with the technology was in a Micro Four Thirds camera that I had a few years ago. Sony has also implemented those techniques in a lot of the cameras that I've used, the Sony a7R III and Sony a7R IV being notable examples with their high-resolution shots. At this point, these cameras have pretty significant limitations with respect to that technology and the implementation of it. Cameras must be on tripods, the image must be pretty darn static, can't be a lot of movement or stuff's going to get weird. While there have been some clunky implementations of this technology inside the actual camera body, that's not always been the case. When I wanted to shoot a high-resolution image on my Sony a7R III, I needed to use the camera on a tripod. Like I said, import the images to my PC, locate the images and make sure that they were the right ones for the high-resolution shot, and then stack them up using Sony's clunky, crash-laden, crappy software. Sorry, Sony, I love your cameras, but your software sometimes sucks. That whole process isn't fun, and a lot of times the juice definitely isn't worth the squeeze. And a word here about AI. One of the most exciting developments in computational photography has been the implementation in various forms of AI, or artificial intelligence. These technologies have opened up a whole new world of possibilities of image processing and enhancement, enabling photographers to achieve results that were once thought impossible. For example, AI-powered algorithms can now automatically identify and remove unwanted objects from images. Pretty darn handy. So much for masking Photoshop. And these same AI techniques can also enhance low-light images, helping to reduce noise and make the images look nicer. At this point in the development of cameras and technology, the quality of the software on the device is almost as important as the hardware. At this point in the video, I think we're pretty much up to speed with the present day. Technological advancement has taken us from shadows on the wall to strange chemical brews to lines of ones and zeros. Photography has fundamentally changed the way we process and consume information. There's a truth to it, an honesty. Photos provide illustrative proof to compelling stories. They provide impactful mementos to provide to family members years after we're gone. And they can be something just as simple as a cheap selfie to send to your friend. And while the future may favor video and other mediums as a way to process and consume information, there will always be a place for photography. It's impossible to oversell photography's importance over the past 200 years. The world simply wouldn't be the same without it. If you've made it this far in this behemoth of a video, I've been working on this script for the better part of a year. This video was really hard to make and it took a whole lot of time. If you wouldn't mind taking this moment to click the subscribe button, it would sure mean the world to me. And if you got value out of this video, leave a comment. It really helps the algorithm. But if you want to learn more about a particularly important company in the history of photography, check out this video I made about contacts. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.